Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the Free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with IG.
Hello, I'm John Pienaar with Times Radio Drive. It is good to have your company. It almost feels like a bad dream, doesn't it? Except that over 200,000 people died in the UK by 2023 COVID. And in a few minutes, live here on the programme, you'll hear the culmination of the inquiry into the political decisions, the emergency measures, the costly mistakes, the lockdowns and the scandalous lockdown-busting parties in Downing Street. It is a truly important moment, so do stay with me, and we'll hear the words in a moment of the inquiry chair, Baroness Heather Hallett, setting out her verdicts on the way that the pandemic was handled. And it is a fair bet her report, her words, will maybe hard for some of the decision takers to hear. Now, the report, a solid report, is now in the process of being released, and some lines are beginning to come out, among them 23,000 people who died could have been saved. British governments during the pandemic failed to appreciate the threat. The response, according to the COVID inquiry report, amounted to too little and too late, and there will be very much more of that very, very soon. Let's just recap on how we got to this point, the point of hearing the detail of this 2-year inquiry, investigation and report. I'm going to be talking later to the Times Health editor, Eleanor Hayward, by the way, who has had sight of the full report. She is going to be joining us and guiding us through its essential and sharpest points. Now, the chair of this inquiry is, of course, Baroness Hallett. The report looks at the political choices that were made at the time, including the lockdowns, how they were introduced, the closure of the businesses, the schools, the social restrictions. You might remember Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, at the time of the pandemic, apologising.
Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering. That I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims.
That was Boris Johnson. You may remember those words. He admitted mistakes were made.
So many people suffered, so many people lost their lives. Inevitably, in the course of trying to handle a very, very difficult pandemic in which we had to balance appalling harms on either side of the decision, we may have made mistakes.
And you will, of course, remember Dominic Cummings, who was at Boris Johnson's side in number 10 Downing Street. He, of course, gave his contribution to the evidence and discussed the thought process as the crisis unfolded.
PM at the time would refer to the mayor of Jaws from the film, who wanted to keep the beaches open. I think he had a routine from previous in his career where he would use that as a joke from one of his sort of after dinner speeches. But he sort of said, there's more harm coming. The mayor was right all along to keep the beaches open, because it would have been a long-term harm to the community.
Dominic Cummings there, just a part of the enormous volume of evidence that led into this inquiry, into this report, which is now being summed up by its chair, Baroness Hallett. Let's cross live to that.
It assesses whether those decisions were reasonable and made on the best available information. Most importantly, it considers whether the appalling loss of life from the COVID-19 virus and the devastating socio-economic consequences that ensued both from the virus and the response could have been reduced. While the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021 undoubtedly saved lives, they also left lasting scars on society, the UK economy. They brought ordinary childhood to a halt, delayed the diagnosis and treatment of non-COVID health conditions, exacerbated societal inequalities, and had a severe impact on people's mental health. These are all issues being explored in other modules in greater detail. In the face of a novel and deadly virus, spreading rapidly around the country, politicians and administrators in the UK government and the devolved administrations were presented with unenviable choices. Whatever decision they took, there was often no right answer or good outcome. They also had to make decisions in conditions of extreme pressure and initially without access to data or a full understanding of the epidemiological position. To assess what was reasonable, one must therefore put the decisions into proper context. Nonetheless, I can summarise my findings of the response as too little, too late. All four governments failed to appreciate the scale of the threat or the urgency of response it demanded in the early part of 2020, relying in part on misleading assurances that the UK was properly prepared for a pandemic. Once the scientific community and the scientific advisors for each nation had become aware that the virus was causing substantially more cases of moderate or severe respiratory illness in China than was being officially reported, and that it had spread from China, the warning signs were there. The tempo of the response should have been increased. It was not. February 2020 was a lost month. There was a serious failure by all four governments to appreciate the level of risk and the calamity that the UK faced and the need to inject urgency into the response. The obviously escalating crisis required leadership from the very top. All four governments knew that in the reasonable worst-case scenario, up to 80% of the population would be infected, with a very significant loss of life. At the same time, it also became clear that the test and trace system was inadequate for a pandemic as a result of flawed pandemic planning. Yet still they failed to take the necessary steps. This meant a national lockdown became more likely. The inquiry does not advocate for national lockdowns, far from it. Restricting people's liberty in such a draconian fashion, with all the devastating consequences, should be avoided if at all possible. But to avoid them, governments must take timely and decisive action to control a spreading virus. The four governments of the UK did not. Had the more stringent restrictions, short of a stay-at-home lockdown announced on the 16th of March 2020, been introduced earlier, when the number of COVID-19 cases was lower, the mandatory lockdown that was subsequently imposed might have been shorter. Conceivably, it might not have been necessary at all. At the very least, there would have been time to establish the effect of the restrictions on levels of incidence and whether there was a sustained reduction in social contact. As it was, the likelihood of a mandatory lockdown significantly increased as a result of the failure to act more speedily and effectively before the 16th of March. By mid-March, the UK government and devolved administrations had received clear and compelling advice. The exponential growth in transmission would likely lead to a loss of life on a scale that was unconscionable and unacceptable. No government acting in accordance with its overarching duty to preserve life could ignore such advice or tolerate the number of deaths envisaged. The governments of the UK, in taking the ultimate step to impose a mandatory lockdown, acted in the genuine and reasonable belief that it was required. They had no choice by then. But it was through their own acts and omissions that they had no choice. Also, the failure to lock down earlier may have cost lives. Had the lockdown been imposed 1 week earlier than the 23rd of March, the evidence suggests that the number of deaths in England alone in the first wave up until the 1st of July 2020 would have been reduced by 48%. That is approximately 23,000 fewer deaths. The decision to impose the first UK-wide lockdown was remarkable for the failure on the part of all four governments to anticipate or plan for the possible need for a mandatory lockdown. Plans for imposing stringent restrictions and for lifting restrictions should have been worked up from the outset. They were not. None of the governments in the UK had adequately prepared for the challenges and risks that a national lockdown presented. They did not scrutinise sufficiently seriously its wider societal, workforce and economic impacts, in particular the impact on the vulnerable and the disadvantaged, and the impact of school closures on children's education and their physical and mental health. Many of the same failings were repeated later in 2020. This was inexcusable. The second wave had been predicted from early in the pandemic. The UK should have been well equipped to respond. Scientific understanding of the virus had matured and data flows were much improved. Testing and surveillance capacity had been strengthened. Each government had ample warning that the prevalence of the virus was increasing and would continue to do so into the winter months. Yet again, there was a failure to take timely and effective action. Such measures as were introduced in England were unlikely to be effective. For example, the rule of six and the tier system. Yet measures like a short circuit breaker lockdown that may have been effective were not imposed in late September or early October 2020. The evidence suggests that had one been imposed in September 2020, the second lockdown on the 5th of November could have been reduced in length and severity and might conceivably have been avoided altogether. Similarly, in Wales, there was a lack of timely planning in relation to the circuit breaker lockdown, which was imposed too late to bring about a significant reduction in the R rate, the figure that represents the average number of people infected by a single infected person. From August to December 2020, Wales had the highest age-standardised mortality rate of the four nations. It is likely that this was a result of a combination of failed local restrictions and the decision to relax non-pharmaceutical interventions too quickly. The decision-making in Northern Ireland was chaotic and infected by political machination. The strained relationship between ministers contributed to an incoherent approach. The circuit breaker restrictions were extended for a week, then lapsed for 1 week, before being reintroduced for 2 weeks, with the 1 week lapse in restrictions correlating to a 25% increase in cases. By contrast, the number of cases in Scotland in autumn 2020 did not peak to the same level as the rest of the UK. By using stringent, locally targeted measures swiftly to deal with outbreaks, case numbers grew much more gradually and avoided the need for a nationwide lockdown in the autumn. Nonetheless, in late 2020, all four nations were hit by a wave of cases. The more transmissible Alpha variant emerged in Kent during the autumn and drove a rapid rise in cases. The emergence of a more transmissible variant was entirely foreseeable, but all four governments failed to take decisive action in response. Rather than recognising the threat early on and introducing measures to control the virus, the four governments continued to press on with plans for relaxing measures over Christmas while cases grew rapidly, only to change course when levels of infection became critical. The failure to take sufficiently decisive and robust action in response created a situation in which governments saw a return to lockdown restrictions as once again unavoidable. In December 2020, the UK became the first country in the world to commence a vaccination programme. This was a remarkable achievement. However, it would take time for the programme to become fully effective. In the meantime, the new variant was still spreading. A failure to take swift and decisive action yet again led to the imposition of another lockdown and closure of schools in January 2021. However, belatedly, the four governments had learned some lessons from 2020 and planned their exit from the 2021 lockdown more effectively. All four governments sought to balance the relaxation of restrictions against the risk that potentially more transmissible and deadly variants would emerge. The task was made considerably easier by the vaccines programme. However, in late 2021, the emergence of the more transmissible Omicron variant caused an increase in infections and led to the further reintroduction of restrictions. An escape variant that can overcome immunity was repeatedly identified as the biggest strategic risk. Yet there were no detailed contingency plans for such a possibility. The sheer number of infections from the new variant demonstrates that had vaccines been less effective, or if the new variant had been as severe as previous ones, the consequences would have been disastrous. Yet with all their experience of the consequences of a pandemic and the response to it, governments still failed to act appropriately. In addition to reaching these conclusions, the inquiry has also addressed other important themes that arise from core political decision-making under the following headings: the membership role and functions of the administrative structures, particularly the emergency advisory bodies providing scientific and technical advice. The Scientific and Advisory Group for Emergencies, known as SAGE, one of the primary sources of expert advice, provided high-quality advice at extreme pace throughout the pandemic. But some aspects of its operation were constrained by the breadth and duration of its operation, the lack of clearly stated objectives by the UK government, and the repeated use of the mantra, following the science. This gave the false impression that decisions were being taken solely on its advice. As a result, some experts were subjected to appalling abuse and threats. What was done to protect the vulnerable from harm? Although the pandemic affected everyone in the UK, it was the vulnerable and the disadvantaged who suffered the most. They were the most affected by the restrictions imposed to control the virus. They were the ones most likely to die. Yet not enough was done to protect them from the virus or the response measures. Whether there were clearly defined, effective and transparent structures for government decision-making. Structures for government decision-making across the UK varied. At the start of the pandemic, the UK government did not have in place a sufficiently robust structure for decision-making long-term and largely bypassed traditional cabinet government. More effective structures were later developed, but this took time. In Wales, the Welsh Cabinet under the First Minister of Wales was fully involved throughout. In Scotland, decision-making rested with a small group of ministers led by the First Minister. She took responsibility for decisions, with the result that ministers and advisers were often excluded from decision-making. In Northern Ireland, the power-sharing arrangements weakened the ability of the executive to respond, and decision-making by the Northern Ireland executive itself was marred by political disputes. The pandemic response also exposed wider issues. The very least the public is entitled to expect is that those making the rules will abide by them. Across the UK, there were instances and allegations of rule-breaking by ministers and advisers that caused huge distress and undermined the confidence of the public in their governments. Finally, under this heading, there was a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of the UK government, and the relationship between ministers in Northern Ireland was poor. This kind of culture is detrimental to good decision-making. How well the four governments communicated with the public. Communications with the public are a critical aspect of pandemic response, and messaging should be carefully crafted to reach as many people as possible, to be as clear as possible, and ensure maximum adherence to the message. For example, the stay-at-home message, developed by communications experts in Number 10 and without input from the NHS or behavioural scientists, was simple and easily understood. It was effective at maximising compliance with the first lockdown. However, its simplicity meant that nuances in the guidance and in the regulations were poorly understood, and people were discouraged from seeking help when they needed it. Other campaigns across the UK varied in their effectiveness. Legislation and enforcement. The UK government relied on existing public health legislation rather than the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. While this enabled rapid action, it came at a cost. It led to fragmented decision-making, reduced parliamentary scrutiny, and it caused public confusion. The regulations introduced were often overly complex and extremely difficult to enforce. Intergovernmental working. The choice of public health legislation to combat the virus meant that each of the devolved nations would be responsible for the response in their areas.
This is John Pienaar with Drive on Times Radio. We're listening live to Baroness Hallett, chair of the COVID inquiry, summing up her findings at the end of the phase of the COVID inquiry concerned with political decision making. We'll stay with this live.
The inquiry heard there was a lack of trust between the then Prime Minister and some of the First and Deputy First Ministers that affected their relationship. Key lessons. The inquiry has identified a number of key lessons learned to inform the response to a future pandemic. They must be considered during the development of future pandemic preparedness strategies. They include the need for multiple scenario planning, the formulation of clear objectives, the need for more constructive working between the governments of all four nations, the need for better communication with the public, the importance of data, and the absolute requirement for quick and decisive action. In all, I make 19 key recommendations that I believe will better safeguard the UK in any future pandemic and improve decision-making in a crisis. They cover the operational workings of SAGE, the extension of the socio-economic duty within the Equality Act 2010, and the use of child rights impact assessments, reforming and clarifying the structures for decision-making during emergencies in each nation, ensuring that decisions and their implications are better communicated for the public, enabling greater parliamentary scrutiny of the use of emergency powers, improving the communication of rules to the public, and establishing structures to improve communication between the four governments during an emergency. I emphasise that further, no less important aspects of how the UK government and the devolved administrations responded to the pandemic are being separately addressed in other of the inquiry's modules. By the end of this year, we will have completed 9 of our 10 module hearings, with reports published throughout 2026 and early 2027. The inquiry's final set of hearings investigating the impact on society, Module 10, have been confirmed for February 2026. As with Module 1, I want to express my gratitude to all those who have given so much of their time and resources in supporting the inquiry's Module 2 investigation. I would like to thank the teams in Modules 2, 2A, 2B and 2C, and the core participants and their legal teams, without whose hard work, diligence and dedication, the hearings and this report would not have been possible. Finally, I want to thank those who lost loved ones or suffered harm in some other way during the pandemic, who gave evidence, contributed to the moving films played at each hearing, attended inquiry events, or contributed to the inquiry's listening exercise, Every Story Matters. They have all shown great courage. Their harrowing accounts not only help me and inform the inquiry's work, but they serve for all time as a reminder of why the work of this inquiry is so important. Unless the lessons are learned and fundamental change is implemented, the human and financial cost and sacrifice of the COVID-19 pandemic will have been in vain.
We have then been listening live to Baroness Hallett, the chair of the COVID inquiry, presenting her findings, presenting her report at the end of a 2-year inquiry involving an enormous amount of written and personal evidence. Strong lines there we heard, all of it wound into a very, very solid report. We heard Baroness Hallett tell us that 23,000 lives could have been saved by quicker, more prompt action by government when it came to reacting to the outbreak of COVID-19 and implementing restrictions. That was done too slow to save lives that could have been saved. She spoke about chaos in government. She also, pointed to severe criticism of the lockdown breaking by ministers, the lockdown parties, which I suppose all of us will remember so very, very vividly, and made recommendations to try to do something to ensure that the same sorts of mistakes are not made again. Eleanor Hayward is the Times Health editor and joins me now live on the line. Hello to you, Eleanor.
Hi.
Hi. So, clearly a pretty powerful presentation by Baroness Hayward, presenting what was clearly a very strong report, which you have had a chance to go through.
Yeah, we, a group of journalists, we went to the County Hall opposite Westminster at 11:30 today and have been sat in a lock-in with the report for the past few hours. It's 760 pages long, so I don't think anyone's actually managed to read it all yet, but I think she summarised it really well. It's kind of, just paints a picture of the state just repeatedly failing the British people, really. And obviously the catastrophic consequences of that are tens of thousands of deaths.
Yes, and I mean, she began this presentation by pointing pretty squarely towards the slowness, avoidable slowness, she suggested, though she did take account of the fact that decision takers, politicians, civil servants in responsible positions were in unknown territory. They were dealing with data of a kind they hadn't seen before. In some ways, they were making it up as well as they were able to, but notwithstanding all of that, Eleanor, time after time after time, restrictions that were brought in could have been brought in faster, and that would have had an enormous effect on later tough action like total lockdowns.
Yeah, she's been quite specific with the first lockdown, which was imposed on 23rd of March 2020. And she said if that was put in place a week earlier, which she thinks is feasible because by that date, the 16th of March, it was very clear that a big lockdown was needed. Other countries are doing it. She said, had Boris Johnson taken that advice, imposed the lockdown, sorry, the police car going past, then 23,000 deaths would have been avoided. And that's just for the first lockdown. And then obviously later on that same year, exactly the same mistake was made. The autumn lockdown was delayed for several weeks. And the death toll just kind of kept stacking up. And she said that to make that mistake again is inexcusable for the government. And
she did, of course, as we would expect, point towards the lockdown breaking at various points by ministers, and I guess everyone will remember the lockdown breaking parties, Partygate as it came to be called. That was the headline after headline, front page after front page, bulletin after bulletin, a running scandal. Now, she spoke about this causing huge distress to so many people. Have you had a chance to have a look at what the report itself says about that lockdown breaking?
Yeah, I mean, it's very damning of the culture in Boris Johnson's Downing Street. I think we've sort of all heard so much about that culture over the past few years that it's almost not surprised by it, but it's still shocking. The sexism as well is particularly highlighted in this report, kind of the crude and rude WhatsApp messages, the swearing, the, disrespect shown to sort of civil servants. And Dominic Cummings comes in for a lot of criticism as kind of being the man responsible for that culture. And the report says that he was taking decisions that should only really be taken by a prime minister. But during some of those really important moments in the pandemic, then Dominic Cummings was the one effectively running the country. Yes.
I mean, the word she used was chaos, Eleanor, wasn't it? And that says a thousand things about the state of things inside government, at the very heart, at the very the very, very top. And she spoke about, well, chaotic decision-taking, but also a breakdown of communication at so many levels, inside government, between government departments and agencies, and between the centre, as it were, the UK centre, and the devolved administrations.
Yeah, that's another big theme of the report, that basically, you know, Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson hated each other, and as a result, then they didn't communicate, which is pretty devastating for people when you've got two nations who are part of one bigger nation, and their leaders aren't communicating with each other.
Does the report put it in those stark terms? These two, at that time, leaders hated each other, and that caused the breakdown.
It doesn't quite say Boris and Nicola Sturgeon hate each other, but it talks about personal differences between the leaders of nations hampering the entire response to the pandemic, and that they're not communicating with each other and sort of almost in competition as well. And that doesn't make for effective government.
Another line that left out of that presentation, Eleanor, was, I suppose, so many did and so many will as you go through the report, but the reference to the harm that was inflicted to children in so many ways by lockdowns, the control of their movements and so on. And we all know about the aftermath of all this, the disruption to education, to children's development and so on. And there are recommendations. She said, the Baroness said that there are 19 recommendations, wasn't it? What particularly leapt out to you?
I mean, to be honest, none of the recommendations seemed that punchy. I mean, I need to have another look through them. And there was things, one of them did concern the four nations working together better. Then there was one about like ensuring data collection is sort of a priority for government. There was, highlighting that in future pandemics, you have to go hard at the beginning with measures. Delays can be terrible and really fatal. There was, I think, the risk of these reports is, especially because there's going to be 10 reports in total, and they're each making, a dozen or so recommendations. It's like, how does Keir Starmer's government really pick which one of those recommendations to prioritise? Because if there's going to be 100 in total, I can't necessarily see them all being given the same priority.
Yeah, and I guess the message at the end of that presentation and the point of this entire exercise, I suppose, Anna, is lessons have to be learned try to be sure that we do not see the same kind of errors again. That lessons are learned. That, in the end, is what truly, truly matters.
Yeah, absolutely, and fingers crossed for everyone that lessons are learned. I think certainly the message that the delay to lockdown was so deadly, so awful. You'd hope that in future governments would act quickly, and that sort of blind panic and slow motion car crash that we saw in March 2020 won't ever happen again.
Right. Eleanor Hayward, thank you so much for joining us with that very, very quick update on where we are following the publication and release of the COVID report. We're going to be carrying on, getting more reaction to this report, what it means and what it hopefully means for the future by way of not repeating awful mistakes in the course of the programme. Now, Christmas is coming. It's a festive first for the UK. The Sunday Times, let me tell you, is going to publish Santa's Extra Nice list next month, and you can nominate the names of the special children in your life to see if they make it onto the list. Just send their name to santa@thetimes.com/Santa. Time now is 4:37.
Times Radio Business News.
I'm joined now in the studio by Robert Miller from the business desk of the Times. Hi to you, Robert.
Hello there, John.
Hi. So what's new in the markets, Robert?
It's almost like a continuation of where we left off yesterday. We were talking about Nvidia and its results and how important they were. They duly reported after the bell, and they were very, very good. Even more pleasing to the market is that the current quarter, the demand is still strong. So their shares rallied strongly. And at the opening today, across Europe, the DAX in Germany, the CAC 40, they were both up 1%. And certainly the FTSE was up much stronger. But coming into the close, we're only up about 37 points. But I should say it's the first rise in 5 days. And filtering through the obvious candidates gaining were those with technology leanings towards the US. So Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust, Polar Capital Trust, Alliance, Capital Trust, you name it, they were up. But there was also some good, strong news, and topping the FTSE 100, a 14% gain in one day, which is massive. It's Games Workshop. It makes the fantasy figurines, and probably best known for its Warhammer franchise. Very strong upgrade to first half profit there. Market loved it. As I said, they topped the leaderboard. And then there was Halma. Very good. It supplies medical and technical equipment, and a very good half year in America. So their shares were up nearly 10%. There was good news there. On the FTSE 250, we had PZ Cussons, the Imperial leather soap and Carex maker. They lifted their profit guidance, so their shares were up. Going the other way shows you bad news, and they head for the exit. Doc Martens, the boot and shoemaker, they were down about 10%, although the losses did narrow there. They did make a loss of 11 million against 28 million last year. And on the other news, I think oil was 64. It's ticked up about 1%, but it's still sub 65, which is good news. And a sterling 130, up a few pfennigs, just probably because of interest rate expectations next month.
Robert Miller, thank you.
Times Radio Business News.
Now let's go back to our rolling coverage of the COVID report, which we've heard opened, we've heard presented just in the last few moments. The full report is now available. It's there, available for anyone to see. Some have had a chance to go through it. We've got a sense of the key recommendations. Now I want to start on the business of getting some reaction and analysis to what we've gleaned so far. So let me welcome now to the studio Professor Kevin Fong, who's a former National Clinical Advisor in Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response at NHS England. Professor, good to see you.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me. Also, let me welcome Peter Openshaw, Professor of Medicine at Imperial College London and a former member of SAGE. Remember SAGE, the scientific advisory group that was guiding so much of the narrative during the course of that pandemic emergency. Professor Openshaw, thank you for joining me.
It was a pleasure to be here. I wasn't on SAGE during the COVID pandemic, but I was during the swine flu pandemic.
Indeed, you were there 2009 to 2012, but that's quite enough expertise to be getting on with. Again, I'm grateful to you for coming. Professor Fong, you've heard what we have heard. I wonder what your initial impressions are.
Yeah, I mean, look, this report is only 40 minutes old so far, but you're hearing the message, too little, too late. And quite striking, that idea of February being a lost month in the response and us not understanding the urgency with which we had to act. I guess that's one of the key messages here, that lack of appreciation that this is a threat that was going to grow exponentially, and that the decision to do nothing is itself a decision. So I think we bore the consequences of that.
Yeah, well, 23,000 people died. It is suggested, it is argued, who would not otherwise have died, Professor. I mean, Lady Hannah made the point at the beginning that those taking decisions were, in a sense, starting this awful journey in the dark. The data was cutting at them thick and fast. They didn't really know what to make of it. They did not know there was going to be an inoculation. There was going to be a vaccine at the beginning of the pandemic, and yet she does, certainly to a significant extent, hold them to account for the slowness of the action that was taken. That restrictions could have been imposed sooner than they were. Is that a fair point in your view?
So I think at the outset, January, February, March 2020, there was a huge cloud of uncertainty around this. So, you have some sympathy for the way that we were able to synthesize a picture on which we could act. However, the inquiry report is quite clear that there was enough evidence, or they believe there was enough evidence, that actions could have been taken. But also in this module report, there is the suggestion that we failed to learn the lessons that we learned in March 2020, and then we repeated them, which led to the scenes that we saw that were pretty awful for the National Health Service in January 2021.
Yeah.
So one can partly understand how difficult it was in January and February and March 2020, less so in the autumn of 2020, when we've learned lessons, we've understood what our capacities are, we understood how hard it was going to be to respond, and yet we were still not really acting with anything like the urgency that we needed to.
Yeah, there was a certain, my word, not hers, a certain amount of sort of vacillation, toing and froing around Christmas, whether or not there should be a lockdown over Christmas. A decision was taken, then it was reversed, and it is, pointed out in this report that the consequence of that was a worse situation later on as we got into the spring.
Yeah, I mean that's the implication, isn't it? And she talks about the possibility that a lockdown a week earlier in March 2020 may have saved up to 23,000 lives. So the same must be true for later lockdowns. And yet again, the inquiry report suggests that those lessons weren't learned, and that we weren't fleet of foot even once we had failed to learn the lessons that were so hard won.
Yeah, Professor Peter Openshaw at Imperial College London. What are your takeaways from what you've been hearing?
Well, I'm very impressed by what I've seen and heard of the report so far. It is an extraordinarily thorough bit of work which has been done. Some people are saying it took longer than it should, but I think, given the extent of the information that they had to look at, it is quite a remarkable bit of work that's been done. I think, to me, the real take home is that politics really matters, and it matters what politicians say, and it matters what politicians do. For all the advice that we can give them as scientists, they have other influences on their decision making that are absolutely crucial, and they have to lead from the front.
I mean, just reflecting on this, I'll ask you both, obviously with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, when you look at the contribution of experts such as you, Professor Fong, and you, Professor Openshaw, do you have regrets? Would you have done it otherwise when you look back at it? Things you feel you could have done perhaps better that you did not? Professor Fong, Professor Fong.
Yeah.
Look, in retrospect, there are things that we could have done better. There are things that went well, and you have to greet those with equanimity.
Yeah.
In the spirit of learning here. For my part, as an individual, I guess I will always look back on whether or not I was able to land the signal properly, that the workforce was at breaking point much earlier than I think we were able to make it realised, if I'm being honest.
And that would have been possible?
That was my job, and part of my job was to make that signal clear, and maybe if I'd made it clearer earlier, there would have been better information with which we could have acted. But there are so many different lessons to learn.
Yeah.
I think the general lesson for everybody is that, as Helen McNamara, Deputy Cabinet Secretary, said in her evidence, that we were too busy looking at equipment and space, and we weren't looking enough at people and the people who had delivered the care. So I think that is something that we should reflect upon as something that might improve a future response, and that's what this is all about. It's about improving the future response.
Yeah, it is ultimately all about that. And Professor Openshaw, we touched on the scientific response with the benefit of hindsight. The criticism was pretty pointed when it came to the administrative oversight of all of this. Chaotic communications, breakdowns, unnecessarily. It suggested bad communications, whatever that happened to be, hostilities, rivalries. I mean, obviously you were bound up in that process too, although not part of that political decision-making. What are your thoughts on what you heard there?
I mean, we obviously weren't involved from NervTag. We weren't involved in the political complications, which I think has come out very clearly from the latest iteration of the Howard report.
And what did you make of what you heard?
I mean, I think from point of view of science, I wish we'd known earlier about the need for masks and the airborne transmission. That was not clear from the science that we had available to us.
Yeah.
I wish we'd known that the vaccines were going to be so amazingly effective earlier. We were not planning for that at all.
No.
Maybe that led to louder voices from the others who thought that maybe we should just let it rip.
Yeah, Professor Openshaw, you were not part of the political policy decisions that were taken. Do you feel let down by the failures that there were in that process?
I think clearly it was a mistake not to lock down faster when we could see that there was a fire burning bright and we were waiting for the surge in NHS admissions to make the situation critical. And it would have been so much better to have locked down earlier.
Okay, and just lastly, a word from both of you on something which I guess touches us all deeply, touches the entire country. We are still living with the impact that there has been on children as a result of the lockdowns and all that has followed, and some of the after effects have been absolutely so severe. I mean, your thoughts on that point, Professor Afong, and the lessons that need to be learned, clearly, when it comes to treatment at a time like that?
Yeah, look, this is not a thing of black and white. This is not about absolute lockdown or letting it rip open. There was a complex plane of solution between those 2 points that we never really found optimally, and this inquiry helps us to learn, doesn't it? It teaches us humility in the face of a threat like this. It teaches us that we have to be decisive in the moment. It means that politicians have to be prepared to act even before it's obvious to the man or woman in the street that something needs to be done. It's too late once it's obvious to everybody. And in the future, we need to have a better plan of preparedness up front. We have to have more resilience already built into our system before we respond. And if we are going to abandon the precautionary principle up front, for any number of reasons, all you are then left with is containment. And if you don't have an adequate strategy of containment, if you can't execute that, then this is what happens.
All right, Professor Openshaw, your last word, and on the matter of children.
I think it's absolutely vital that we get more sort of scientifically educated people into government, into Whitehall. I think that would be enormously helpful if that could be done. The impact on children, I mean, it was highly variable. There's been heartbreaking evidence presented to the inquiry about the impact on children and the education of children, which was very non-uniform. It hit those who are most socially deprived greater than those who maybe had better support. So it was a very irregular effect on children, and it was only fairly late that it became evident that the new evolving strains were transmitting, particularly amongst school children. It wasn't the case in early in the pandemic. So the evidence did change.
All right, Professor Peter Openshaw, Professor Kevin Fong, thank you both. Really grateful to you for coming in and joining the conversation. Now, coming up after 5 o'clock, we'll have more reaction to the COVID inquiry findings, the finding that chaos in government was a feature of the response. I'm going to be talking to the chair of the Health Committee at Westminster. That's the Liberal Democrat MP, Leda Moran, and also to a member of the COVID-bereaved families. You can also hear my interview with the former head of the CIA, General David Petraeus, after the reports of a peace deal being discussed between America and Russia. And as we do each Thursday, I'm going to be looking at the latest in the opinion polls and talking to Luke Trill from the pollster More in Common. But before 5, what are the implications of the proposed peace deal for Ukraine? I'm going to be talking to a leading professor of strategic studies. It's now 4:51. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive.
John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Multiple reports are saying that the USA and Russia have devised a 28-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. It involves terms that require Ukraine to give up land, to reduce its military by half, and never allow foreign troops on its territory. European leaders have meanwhile been meeting in Brussels, and the French Foreign Minister had this to say.
Discussions should start with a ceasefire on the contact line that allow for negotiation on the question of territories, on the question of security guarantees. We have said that, the US have said that, President Trump has said that, and Ukrainians are ready for this. The only obstacle to such the ordered discussions so far is Vladimir Putin.
It's the French Foreign Minister speaking in Brussels a short while ago. Now, I can welcome to the programme Professor Phillips O'Brien, who's a Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews University. Hello to you, Professor.
How are you doing, John?
I am well, and thank you for coming on the show. Really keen to hear your views, Professor, because it is, isn't it, a safe bet? It's a certain bet that Ukraine's leaders will oppose what this latest deal seems to be. And it's hard to blame them, isn't it, given what they're fighting for and the sacrifices that they've had to make.
It's a terrible deal for Ukraine. I mean, it's basically the Russian deal, which the U.S. government has agreed to. So Russia gets almost everything it wants and gives up almost nothing. The issue, and the Ukrainians will not want this deal under almost any circumstances. It's hard to see how Ukraine could exist as an independent country if this deal goes through. The problem that Ukraine will face is we don't know what the European reaction will be. The European states are going to have to, at this point, if the U.S. is very serious about this deal, and Trump has endorsed it, if the U.S. is serious about this deal and tries to impose it, then European states are either going to have to stand up for Ukraine and say, no, we'll back you if you turn it down, or put pressure on Ukraine to accept it or a version close to it. So we would reach a real crunch point if that happens. We're not there yet, but this is a terrible deal for Ukraine.
Is it conceivable that Ukraine could be compelled to accept the deal? We don't have the detail of the deal. In a sense, we're going by seemingly well-informed but partial reports. But the idea of handing over unconquered Ukrainian territory in the east of Ukraine to Russia, even, as one report suggests, under some form of land lease, that would amount, in the view of Ukraine, and objectively, it would amount to a form of surrender.
Well, it certainly would amount to the United States taking Vladimir Putin's side in the war against Ukraine. So it would be the United States saying, we are going to compel you, Ukraine, a democracy, to hand over land to a dictatorship, land that dictatorship has not conquered, because we believe that is the best way to get out of the war. So, I mean, that's what it represents. The key thing that it represents is what it means for the U.S. government at present and what the U.S. government is prioritizing. And clearly, the U.S. government is prioritizing its relationship with Russia over its relationship with Ukraine and Europe. Now, they might not be able to get that, but that is the reality.
And how do you analyze that? I mean, just in the last, couple of days, we saw President Trump pretty clearly placing the value of the Saudi Arabian relationship with the United States, maybe as an economic partner, above any consideration of morality or principle. The murder of a Saudi journalist came up, we saw, with pretty spectacular effects in the Oval Office. Is it your view that the president's approach to Russia is based on some comparable calculation?
It's his relationship with everyone. He doesn't care about democratic states or free states. They're almost, in his mind, weak states. He likes dealing with dictators and authoritarians. That is where he's comfortable. That is who he praises. He praises them all the time. And he looks down on European democracies, who he considers weak and soft. And Europeans are kidding themselves if they think Trump actually likes them or respects them. He would rather have a deal with Putin. Putin is the kind of leader he admires and he wants to work with, not Zelensky.
President Trump does seem to believe, doesn't he, Professor, that Russia in the Ukraine war is a relentless and unbeatable enemy.
Yeah.
To what extent do you believe that to be true?
Well, it's not true, but it's basically the United States is not. I mean, what he has done since he's become president is basically get the United States out of weaponing, providing support to Ukraine. They've sold a small amount of weapon, $2 billion in weapons since he's been president. The Biden administration gave $130 billion. So what Trump has done is basically pulled the U.S. out, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if Ukraine gets no support from the United States, it's going to be in a harder position. Europeans have stepped up a little, but a lot are not. Ukraine can win this war, but it has to be helped to win it. And right now, neither the U.S. or the Europeans seem willing to do that.
It does seem clear, though, lastly, Professor, from all that you hear of the Ukrainian leadership, and we all are aware now that the Ukrainian political leadership is in a stew in Kyiv. There's a corruption row going on, which will be clouding the thinking of policymakers there. But from what you hear from pretty much all of them, they will fight to the last man. They will fight with pointed sticks if weapons are denied. This will not end in a quick capitulation by Ukraine. It can only drag on, surely.
Well, they'll want to. Again, there becomes a question of what you can do and what you want to do. They will want to fight, but say if European states say to them, we are not going to back you at all, then they might have to take a very bad deal. So a lot of this will come down to how European states react if indeed President Trump tries to foist this plan. Okay. It will come down to Europe.
And we will watch how that story develops, because it's developing now, as it were, in real time. Professor Phillips O'Brien from St Andrews University, thank you so much. I'm going to be talking very soon to the former high-ranking American commander and head of the CIA, General David Petraeus. This is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar with Times Radio Drive, and here are the headlines. The COVID inquiry says chaos at the heart of government and failure to take COVID seriously cost 23,000 lives in the first wave of the pandemic. And Subhana Mahmood set out plans to make migrants who arrived after Brexit wait 20 years to get settled status. And coming up, you can hear my interview with the man who was once in charge of the CIA, General David Petraeus. What does he make of America making a peace plan for Ukraine with Russian officials? And we're going to be checking in on the latest in the opinion polls. Talk to Luke Trill from Mooring Common.
This is Times Radio.
And here's the news with Tom Noonan.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. The chair of the COVID inquiry says lockdowns could have been avoided and tens of thousands of lives might have been saved if it weren't for poor government decision-making. Baroness Hallett says national and devolved governments were forced into potentially avoidable lockdowns by a lack of early action.
across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with IG.
It is good to have your company on Drive on Times Radio. I'm John Pienaar. So we have heard then the chair of the COVID inquiry, Lady Hallett, present her report together with its, in some cases, severely critical findings after 2 years of investigation. The Hallett report, the COVID report, talks about chaos at the top and at the heart of government. It talks about the avoidable, or perhaps avoidable, loss of maybe 23,000 lives through slow responses from government, that restrictions on movements could have been brought in harder and faster, and the result was tragic in so many cases. Better communication was needed. Children suffered at the time and since in disruption to their education and to their lives. And the Baroness and the report say that things should be done differently in the future. She laid out criticism of all governments in Britain.
The inquiry does not advocate for national lockdowns. Far from it. Restricting people's liberty in such a draconian fashion, with all the devastating consequences, should be avoided if at all possible. But to avoid them, governments must take timely and decisive action to control a spreading virus. The four governments of the UK did not.
Lady Hallett called out the culture within Number 10.
Finally, under this heading, there was a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of the UK government, and the relationship between ministers in Northern Ireland was poor. This kind of culture is detrimental to good decision-making.
And her report heavily criticised a lack of urgency by the government.
They also had to make decisions in conditions of extreme pressure, and initially without access to data or a full understanding of the epidemiological position. To assess what was reasonable, one must therefore put the decisions into proper context. Nonetheless, I can summarise my findings of the response as too little, too late.
And the timing of lockdowns cost lives, she said.
Also, the failure to lock down earlier may have cost lives. Had the lockdown been imposed 1 week earlier than the 23rd of March, the evidence suggests that the number of deaths in England alone in the first wave up until the 1st of July 2020 would have been reduced by 48%. That is approximately 23,000 fewer deaths.
So let's now first speak to Layla Moran, who's the Liberal Democrat MP who chairs the Health and Social Care Select Committee at Westminster. Hello to you, Layla.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hi, it's good to have you here, and I'm keen to get your view. So it was a strong report in so many respects. Tell me what your thoughts are on what you heard.
Well, look, I mean, my first thoughts undoubtedly are with the bereaved, with everyone who was affected, some with life-limiting conditions like long COVID who are still suffering, and all the young people who have found themselves still behind because of the chaotic nature of the decision-making and the late characterization of the decision-making. From my perspective, I mean, I was chairing the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus during that period. We constituted because we could see that something was going wrong at the heart of government. And what I think Baroness Hallett has laid bare today was that that was absolutely the case. The science was clearly at points pointing in one direction. And I was told an anecdote by a colleague of mine who, on the day of the Cheltenham races, that week before that she talks about that could have saved 23,000 lives, they were in a room in Cobra asking the government, why aren't we locking down? And questioning why, when the science was clearly going in one direction, an exponential growth, we weren't locking down. So I just have to, at this point, sort of, we look back with sadness, with anger, and I'm feeling angry. I'm sure a lot of other people feel angry, but we also have to think now, how do we make this better for next time? And one of the key takeaways for me is that when the science is telling you something, you first of all have to listen, but then you don't also hide behind it as if your decision making that was in part led by your own political ambition, which is clearly what Boris Johnson was doing, then clouded that science, made wrong decisions, and then pretended it wasn't his decision that he made. And I think that's the bit that's totally inexcusable,
yes.
Given how many people ended up so badly hurt by what happened.
Now, I want to come back to, and I will, the examples of poor decision making, late decision taking, which we know had a very heavy cost. But it'll be part of your job later, won't it, on the Health Committee, to look at the changes that have to be made now, changes in the structure of decision making by politicians, by officials with decision taking power. Changes in that way. And what are the big takeaways where that's concerned? What has to change now that can be changed?
Well, I will admit, John, it came out just an hour ago. I was mainly listening to the speech that Baroness Hallett gave, and it's an 800-page document just for this module alone. So I can't preempt exactly which of the 19 recommendations are the lowest hanging fruit, but actually I would urge that every single one is implemented. And what we do know, and what I've seen in this role, is that government is very good at setting up inquiries, and it was a battle to set this one up in the first place. What it is terrible at is then enacting all the recommendations that come from these inquiries. And what would be further inexcusable beyond the second lockdown and everything else that happened at that time is that having put so much time and energy into this COVID inquiry with all of its recommendations and then not enacting every single one in a timely way, because we simply don't know when the next pandemic is going to happen, but we do know it is going to happen. That is itself inevitable, and we should take that seriously. Then that, I think, has the role of select committees and also other arms of government. We have to make sure that this isn't one of those inquiries that, like so many, sits on a shelf and is looked at nostalgically one day with very few of the recommendations actually implemented. And I think that's something we can absolutely agree that we should do.
All right. Leila Moran of the Health Committee at Westminster, thank you so much. Now, let me welcome to the programme Rivka Gottlieb, who's a spokesperson for COVID-19 bereaved families for justice. Rivka, thank you for coming along.
Thank you for having me.
Rivka, it must in so many ways, and not for the first time, have been quite hard to listen to what was done wrong, the way the pandemic was managed, analysed in the way that it was, because the cost of it in human terms is so well known to all of us and so keenly felt by you, Rivka, and other members of the Bereaved Families for Justice group. And hearing what we heard again today, it must have just revived the anger you felt in the past.
That's exactly what's happened. And I actually didn't anticipate how angry and how upset I would be feeling. In many ways, the report is vindication, because it says a lot of what we have been saying all along. But it's outrageous. It's shocking to hear it again. And I think as a society, we've moved on and we've forgotten. There's been a bit of a collective amnesia, but we mustn't forget, because if we do, this will happen again.
Yeah. Well, this exercise, such an important test that something is done, more than something, a great deal is done to make sure that people in the future do not have to suffer what you suffered, as and when the next pandemic comes along. And the experts will say, well, it's more a matter of when than if. When you listen to the report, when you listen to the inquiry chair earlier on, what really struck with you, the points that you were so keen to hear made, Rivka?
I think for me, the timeline that she laid out is exactly what we have been saying all along. The fact that the science was not listened to, that there was chaos in government, that the lockdown, the first lockdown, if it had happened a week earlier, so many lives would have been saved, including my father's. There was just point after point after point that we have felt very often as though we're shouting into a void, and it's been a very difficult process working with the inquiry. But I do feel that our message and what we wanted exposed has indeed come out. The most important thing now is recommendations implemented, as Leila Moran said. We've been calling for a national oversight mechanism that ensures that recommendations from inquiries are indeed implemented, because too often that does not happen, and mistakes are made again and again.
And there were 19 recommendations in all. One of them, I could pick on, I guess, a number of them, but the recommendation that expert groups should be in place to advise ministers on the economic and social implications, and not just the science of the decisions they take in the course of an emergency like that. When you hear it put like that, it just seems so obvious, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? Yes. An awful lot seems very obvious. And to be honest, at the time, I remember sitting and watching the news and screaming at the television as we saw the virus coming from Italy, from Spain. We knew what was coming and nothing was being done. The government were not listening. They weren't listening to the experts. They weren't listening to ordinary people. And it was the decision-making was also made by such a tiny cluster of people who all had similar socioeconomic backgrounds. That was also a failure and mustn't be allowed to happen again.
All right, Rivka Godley of COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. Rivka, really grateful to you. Thank you. Now I can
Thank
talk
you very
now.
much for having me.
It was good to have you here, and we can hear now from Nadra Ahmed, who's the executive chairman of the National Care Association. Nadra, welcome to you.
Well, good evening.
Evening to you. The report is only freshly released, only freshly available to be studied. But from what you've seen, Nadra, what do you make of what you've heard?
Well, I think Baroness Hallett has obviously listened very carefully and come out with some really important phrases. You know, too little, too late, I think is really important. I think the other thing about sort of really ignoring the science, we've got to be really careful, because we were all in, we were all in a bit of a shock. We didn't act in time. Our bit of the sector was completely ignored from the outset. We were told, certainly in February, she's picked that up, that February was a month that's lost, because in February, mid-February, we were being told that actually this was not going to have a major impact on the social care sector, and we didn't have too much to worry about. We were still getting over the kind of hang of Brexit, having lost staff there. We were trying to bring lots of things into play. So I think all those messages, I think the truth wasn't there. I feel that quite quickly we all started to lose a bit of trust in the people that were making the decisions, because we could see that some of those decisions that were being made were going to have a major impact, especially on things like the social care sector.
Yes. I mean, look, some lessons, I suppose, it can be said they become apparent at the time or over the course of the event while it's happening in real time. In other cases, it seems so obvious. And the release of the virus into care homes, where they did enormous amounts of damage, there were so many saying that was foreseeable and that could have been acted upon sooner than it was.
Absolutely, it could have been. I think, that there were some mixed messages, because the virus, we were told quite early on, it would affect the frail and the vulnerable, and that sort of seemed to be the messaging that was coming out. But then it was contradicted by, actually, care homes don't need to worry, but we look after frail and vulnerable people. I remember saying all of this at the time. And then let's not discharge people out of hospitals. But then there was the whole messaging around keeping the NHS safe. We needed to empty out the hospitals. So where were we sending them? We were sending them into care settings, untested. We know that wasn't, but there wasn't even a messaging that be careful, because if you do take people, you need to cohort them, or you need to be, isolating. None of that guidance was very clear. And I think that the bit that really is the most challenging for us to even think through is the fact that PPE was being diverted. We have infection control as part of the way that we run our services. We have to have high levels of it. We've kept neurovirus out of our services. So we do work really hard on that, so viruses don't spread. And yet here we were our PPE was being diverted to the NHS. So our workforce was having to use bin liners it was just appalling.
Yeah,
and those were
avoidable.
Those were avoidable, and that's not rocket science, really, that frail and vulnerable were going to be hit, and we should have been protected, or the guidance should have been much, much clearer for us.
Yeah. The memory of care workers and of NHS staff.
Absolutely.
Try to protect themselves with plastic bags, with bin liners and the like. That is a distressing memory. Nadra Ahmed, thank you for joining me on the programme.
Thank you.
Now, coming up after 5:30, Dan Paskins, the Interim Executive Director for Save the Children, will give us his reflections on today's report. Firstly, I'll be talking to Times Radio's political editor, who will get us up to date with the Home Secretary's new crackdown on legal migration. And we will have our daily budget update from the Times business columnist Ian King. Time is 5:20. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive.
Times Radio Drive with IG. Invest more, pay less with zero commission on all stocks and shares. Search IG.com to find out more. Capital at risk, other fees may apply.
Now, here is a truly useful tip if you don't know this already. If you're a digital subscriber to the Times and the Sunday Times, you get access to a whole range of newsletters, and that includes the politics newsletter. It's delivered straight to your inbox every morning, 7 days a week. And to sign up to that, which I really recommend, just log into your Times account and head to My Newsletters. Now, let's talk about the political picture today. Today, the Home Secretary has been laying out plans to double the length of time that a legal migrant has to wait to apply for permanent residence in this country. Rather than 5 years, as at the moment, the wait time will now be 10 years.
Those who speak English to a degree level standard could qualify for a 9-year path to settlement. Those paying the higher rate of tax could qualify at 5 years, while those on the top rate could qualify after 3, the same as those on global talent visas. Those who work in a public service, including doctors, teachers, nurses, would qualify after 5 years.
So that's Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, and Anna Mihailova, Times political editor, here with me in the studio. Hello to you, Anna.
Hi, John.
So just set out for us this plan, this new plan, this additional plan by the Home Secretary.
Yes, so she came to the Chamber, she set out these tougher rules on settled status, and the part of it that's got everyone talking in Westminster is that migrants who are on benefits for more than 12 months would have to wait 20 years for settlement. So that 20 is that headline figure, but as that clip showed quite well, she also announced a lot of different rules for different kinds of people. So the aim is not to be too blunt with this instrument, but at the same time get that headline that it could be up to 20 years, which is obviously a huge toughening and has had, you know, MPs more on the left of the party absolutely furious, but it also will make the calculation from Shabana Mahmood is that those voters who are so worried about migration and also the use of welfare and the increase of the welfare budget, those voters will be happy to hear it.
Right, so these are tough plans presented in tough and carefully chosen language.
Absolutely, but for me, the thing that really stood out in what she said was she intentionally used the words Boris wave to describe some of the specific migration that she's trying to really curb and trying to impose tougher rules for. And Boris wave, as you remember, entered the lexicon thanks to Nigel Farage. He's the first one who started calling the migration of the last few years, that huge spike in legal migration after COVID, the Boris wave, as an attempt to, I mean, that was very much seen as a political move by Reform to further kneecap the Conservative Party, to essentially make sure it never comes back, make sure that voters continue to be furious with it. I find it very interesting that Shabana Mahmood has gone out of her way to use that same rhetoric, not least because tactically for Labour, there are people who say now that Labour, almost looking at the polling, shouldn't want the Conservatives to be completely wiped out, because you almost want the Conservatives to continue to take some votes off Reform. We're in the reverse scenario of 2024. So it is absolutely fascinating, I think, that she has chosen specifically that language.
All right, Anna Mihайлова, thank you so much. Now, it is 5:25.
Budget preview on Times Radio Drive with IG. Invest more, pay less with zero commission on all stocks and shares. Search IG.com to find out more. Capital at risk, other fees may apply.
So what is the word? What is the buzz? What is the gossip on the budget next week? For our regular look into the mists of the not so distant future, let's talk to Ian King, the Times business economist. Hi to you, Ian.
Evening, John.
Hi, tell me, what's going on in your mind now? What are you picking up? The Bank of England, for example. And the Chancellor's fiscal headroom, which seems to twist and turn and get smaller.
Yes, that's right. We've had a report out today from the New Economics Foundation, which is a left-leaning think tank, which is taken quite seriously in government circles, not least because its previous head was a lady called Miata Fahnbulleh, who's now a junior minister in the Department for Local Government. And they've basically published a report on the costs of the Bank of England's quantitative tightening. Now, this is the opposite of quantitative easing. You'll remember during the global financial crisis and again during the pandemic, the Bank of England bought gilt UK government bonds and other assets in order to introduce liquidity into the system. Well, now the bank is reducing the size of its balance sheet, offloading some of these gilts, but it's unfortunately doing so at a loss. And the New Economics Foundation says that this is going to effectively reduce the Chancellor's headroom by £4.8 billion in 2029-30, when, of course, she's supposed to be balancing the books according to her fiscal rules. The interesting thing here is, John, there are some quite strange bedfellows making these kind of comments, because, of course, this has been a big point that Reform has been campaigning on of late. Richard Tice and Nigel Farage have been talking a lot about this in recent times. They don't think the bank should be embarking on QT just now. The New Economic Foundation also says that there's scope here to change the way that the bank accounts for these losses. At the moment, the Bank of England is indemnified by the Treasury on these losses, and the New Economics Foundation pointing out that other big central banks, where they've made a loss on their asset purchases, like the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, they basically have to stomach those losses themselves. Now, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, published a letter last week in response to some of the comments that Reform have been saying, and he argues that over the long term, over the full scale of the programme, the benefits of QE will outweigh any losses from QT. So you pay your money and you take your choice. And the Economics Foundation also, incidentally, want changes to the way that the Bank of England currently pays out full interest rates to the banks on their deposits held at the central bank. It says that that shouldn't really be the case. And this has been a long-standing argument for a lot of people on the left, including Gordon Brown, incidentally, although the Chancellor is dead against it, we think.
Yeah, there's so much speculation in, isn't there, that the Chancellor may squeeze the owners of more expensive homes, and Rachel Reeves is getting a bit of pre-budget pushback.
Yes, absolutely. As we were discussing this time yesterday, a lot of Labour MPs in London and the South East are quite concerned at the level at which this extra dollop of tax, it could be a mansion tax, it could be an extra tier of council tax, we just don't know the details. But there's a lot of speculation that if this is brought in at bands F, G and H, potentially you've got homes as low as £1.4 million being dragged into the Chancellor's tax net. And a lot of Labour MPs very, very concerned about this. I should also say, John, we've also had a survey out today from Rightmove, the online property portal. They've surveyed 10,000 people who are contemplating a move, and it says that 1 in 5 of them has put those plans on hold because of concerns that they have over potential taxes on residential property coming up in the budget. Most of those are in the southeast of England and in the West Country.
Ian King, good to talk to you. Let's talk again tomorrow.
Budget preview on Times Radio Drive with IG. Invest more, pay less with zero commission on all stocks and shares. Search IG.com to find out more. Capital at risk, other fees may apply.
Now, coming up very soon, you can hear my conversation with the former head of the CIA. That's General David Petraeus, also a former high-ranking military commander. What does he make of these reports of plans being cooked up by Russia and the US to end the war in Ukraine? And we're going to be looking at the latest in the opinion polls with Luke Trill from the pollster More in Common. And after 6, of course, it is Pienaar and Friends, when I'm going to be joined by Adam Bolton and by our political editor, Anna Mihailova. Now, though, let's get the news with Tom Noonan.
Times Radio Drive with IG. Invest more, pay less with zero commission on all stocks and shares. Search IG.com to find out more. Capital at risk, other fees may apply.
So as you've been hearing live here on Drive, Baroness Heather Hallett, has delivered the second set of findings in the COVID inquiry. The chair of the COVID-19 investigation, this is after 2 years, said the inexcusable delays under Boris Johnson led to 23,000 deaths in the first wave of the pandemic. Lady Hallett laid out criticism of all governments in the UK.
This meant a national lockdown became more likely. The inquiry does not advocate for national lockdowns, far from it. Restricting people's liberty in such a draconian fashion, with all the devastating consequences, should be avoided if at all possible. But to avoid them, governments must take timely and decisive action to control a spreading virus. The four
Lady Hallett heavily criticised a lack of urgency by the government.
Had the lockdown been imposed 1 week earlier than the 23rd of March, the evidence suggests that the number of deaths in England alone in the first wave up until the 1st of July 2020 would have been reduced by 48%. That is approximately 23,000 fewer deaths. The decision to impose the first UK-wide lockdown was remarkable for the failure on the part of all four governments to anticipate or plan for the possible need for a mandatory lockdown.
So let us get the thoughts now of Dan Paskins, who's Interim Executive Director for Save the Children. Welcome to you, Dan. Thank you for joining me.
Good evening, John.
Hi. So look, it's less than 2 hours since this report was made openly available, but I imagine you will have some thoughts to share on what you've heard.
Absolutely. So the report is very, very detailed, covers lots of information because it's about all the different political and the sort of key decision making all the way through the pandemic. But it's something that we've been really working to sort of share evidence with the inquiry, and particularly the experience of children and families. And as the chair has said, it's clear that there were a number of failings by key individuals like the Prime Minister and many top politicians. But also, this wasn't just about individuals taking bad decisions. There wasn't enough thought about how to take good decisions in a time of crisis. Yeah. And also, particularly, what that meant was there wasn't enough thought about the impact on those who weren't directly affected by the pandemic, like children, but who were affected by the decisions that were taken.
Right, and we have seen in the report there is recommendations for more organised forms of advice to be given to government ministers and others before they make key decisions, which is pretty much what you're saying there. So from what you've heard, is this the report that you hoped to see? Of course, the test of it is how it's acted upon. But what did you make of what you heard by way of this report?
Yes, so this report has very seriously and thoughtfully engaged with the evidence. Obviously, inevitably, a lot of the reporting will be about sort of some of the individuals, but I think it's really important that the lessons are learned, as you say, both about how this crisis could have been better handled, but also how we learn lessons for future crises. So there's recommendations in the report about things like having something called a child rights impact assessment. So that's saying that whenever there is a major decision, and particularly when having to take rapid decisions with uncertain evidence, as happened during the pandemic, it's really important to think about the impact on children and on their rights. Another recommendation was about, or another key finding, which again very much was something that charities like us found during the pandemic, is that what happened was that inequalities were reinforced. So basically, those people who had the toughest time before the pandemic were also those who had the worst time during the pandemic. And again, there's recommendations about how to make sure that those who are having the sort of toughest time are prioritised.
And that was one of the more painful aspects of what the country's children went through. That those who were most disadvantaged suffered the most, disproportionately more than those who were less disadvantaged. We saw education disrupted, didn't we? And the children are still living, still unable to catch up with the education, the teaching that was lost there. So you see in this report a key, at least, to making sure that the same thing doesn't happen again in the same circumstances.
Absolutely, that's really important, because the impact of the decisions taken during lockdown will stay with children for years to come. We know there are children who were babies and toddlers during the pandemic, in lockdown, not able to see other children, not able to get access to support. 3 or 4 years later, those same children are starting school and more likely to still be turning up in nappies, not toilet trained, not ready to participate in learning. We know that unless action is taken, those children who had the toughest time will feel the impact now and for decades to come in the future. And of course, that will affect all of us. So we need to see now from this government more decisive action to help children, those children who really bore the brunt, who sacrificed so much during the pandemic. The government needs to invest more in helping them, and particularly to tackle child poverty. And that's what we're hoping to see in the days ahead.
And can you say you feel confident that the lessons you're talking about there, that Lady had pointed to in her report and in her presentation, that those lessons will be taken aboard and will be acted upon, Dan?
I mean, we'll have to see how they're acted upon, but it is a really significant milestone that in this, which is the official record of the COVID inquiry, has sort of so thoughtfully engaged with the evidence, has sort of shared lessons, both which can be acted on now, but also which can act as a bit of a sort of manual when there are future crises. Hopefully that's whoever the decision makers are of the future can learn the lessons from this and make sure that they act on them when they need to do so.
Yeah, and it's such an important point. Dan Paskins at Save the Children, thank you. Now, let me just bring you a piece of breaking news. Parts of the venue for the COP30 summit in Brazil have been evacuated after reports of a fire. UK delegate, Labour MP Mary Cray, has tweeted that she's one of those who've been evacuated. Brazil's tourism minister has said the fire's under control and no one has been hurt. We will continue to watch that story. Now, as the reports keep coming of the plans between Russia and the United States, there are officials on either side to end the war in Ukraine. We don't seem to be making a huge amount of progress in finding much of a wider agreement. I've been talking to General David Petraeus. He's the former CIA director and US commander of the US Central Command. He also commanded in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he's been speaking at the Price of War Symposium in London, and he told me about what Europe and America should do to force Putin to come to the table.
Well, I actually think there's an opportunity right now, both because of much greater European speed and actions and diplomacy and greater spending on defense, increasingly substantial support for Ukraine. It now has not only exceeded the U.S. in support when you total up all categories, but now has even done more in the defense realm. And there's a unique opportunity by Europe to collateralize the $200 billion equivalent of Russian reserves in European banks, and also the fragility of the Russian economy and the fact that Russia will run out of money in its national welfare fund, which has been diverted. And so you put that together, and the European Union just did its 19th round of sanctions. The U.S. is now implementing sanctions on Lukoil, Rosneft, and dozens of other companies. I think there's actually a chance where we could carry out two baskets of action that could potentially lead Vladimir Putin to realize that he needs to have a cessation of hostilities because of the pain inflicted not just on the battlefield, where he seems to be impervious to the fact that nearly 1.2 million Russian soldiers have been killed and wounded. That doesn't seem to concern him. But if you run out of money and you can't go to the IMF or the World Bank for a loan, so help them militarily, stop the Russians on the front lines, protect the airspace better, and then go after Russia economically and financially so that you crush the Russian war economy. You deprive it of its means by going after those who are enabling it by buying oil and gas. I actually think you could have a Russian cessation of hostilities at both countries. And then if you add a third component, which would be ironclad threats that if Russia resumes aggression, that you will take further actions to sanction them financially and economically. And you'll also have an ironclad promise to help Ukraine even more than we have, that you might even make this cessation durable in a way that it otherwise would not be. So again, this is a unique opportunity. This is notwithstanding the very, very tough times for both sides.
Yes.
All that notwithstanding, I think there actually is a chance right now to do something that hasn't been possible before. I think you're in a much stronger negotiating position if you do what I've advocated as well.
Okay, well, that is a powerful set of arguments. Let me just unroll some of those points, because individually they are really quite compelling. I mean, you argue that it is possible to think about crushing the Russian economy, and you point out that as costly as this war has been for Ukraine, it's also been terribly costly for Russia. 1 million Russian casualties on the battlefield, half of those killed or taken permanently out of commission.
That's important to note. That again, they're either dead or they couldn't be returned to the front lines. They were so seriously wounded.
Yeah, and now we are at a point, or maybe at any point, where to make concessions to Russia would be simply the wrong way to go. It would be possible, you argue, to bring Russia to the negotiating table, to force Russia to the negotiating table and not drag Ukraine into negotiations on terms it would not wish to see.
I think that's correct. Now, again, everything is speculation about what's in whatever agreement is out there, the 28 points, what they consist of. All that. I just don't feel knowledgeable enough to even have any comment on that, although clearly there are some who have either gotten leaks or have gotten some kind of information that causes them to have concerns about it. And certainly some of the previous proposals, I share some of the concerns about those, although I think it was also right for President Trump to try to bring about a cessation of hostilities, to stop this horrible war, as he describes it, to stop the killing. The question is, how do you go about that? We tried the red carpet approach. I think that was appropriate to try. And Russia, Vladimir Putin responded with the greatest number of missiles and drones on a number of successive nights after he got back to Russia. So,
but General, there is still, is there not, it's now pretty apparent after recent talks and meetings that the administration and the White House, President Trump's administration, does again seem set on making concessions to Russia that Ukraine would see as capitulation. And it's easy to see why President Zelensky and those around him would see it that way.
Well, again, I don't know the details of the agreement. Again, from some of the reports, there's speculation about which I would be concerned if some of the details are there. But noting again, it's just premature to get into any kind of.
Well, in general principle, if I may, General, what would you say to the idea that it would simply be unjustified and wrong to give concessions at this point of any kind, even though we don't know the detail of this particular latest plan? It would be wrong to give concessions to Russia now that Russia could not take by force.
Again, as a general principle, I think that is correct. But again, you need to actually know what is it that they're talking about.
No, I'm addressing the principle. I'm addressing the principle there.
In return. Now, we do know that what we do know is that Russia has never wavered from what can be described as maximalist objectives. And the Ukrainians told me they've actually captured Russian soldiers who have been in the Russian army, not just their Russian unit, but the Russian army less than 2 weeks. This is malpractice. This is hard to believe, but what it indicates is they're signing somebody up, shoving them into a uniform, issuing a rifle and a Kevlar helmet, and racing to the unit. And then on arrival, the soldiers told, run across the street with these other two guys who you don't know and with whom you haven't developed cohesion or friendship, and see how far you can get.
Yes. I mean, when we look at what we hear from President Trump time and again, he says his main concern is to stop the killing, and he very obviously has his heart set on a Nobel Peace Prize. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd love to see the killing stopped as well. I think I applaud that impulse, that desire, that objective. The question is, how do you stop it? Yeah. And how durable will the agreement be that you reached to stop it?
That's General David Petraeus, the former director of the CIA, talking to me just ahead of the programme. Now, on top of this full full-scale, awful war and a certain amount of domestic political chaos, Ukraine is facing another crisis. The World Health Organization estimates almost 10 million people in Ukraine suffer from a mental health condition. And this is in a country where there's only one psychologist per 100,000 people in some areas. Now, Klara Seladorovich has been working on an AI platform to combat that crisis and has been speaking at the Price of War conference in London. She told me afterwards about that project.
So we've been building an AI model to give mental health support to help augment the vast need for mental health assistance. It also has a triage system where we're able to refer out care to individuals we flag as needing a higher level of care. But essentially, the goal is to have a personalized, anonymous pocket companion that you can turn to in tough moments in Ukraine, which there are a lot of. Occasionally the air sirens, go off in the middle of the night and people sometimes need somewhere else to turn to. And so our goal is to fill that need and help support the work that therapists there are doing.
Well, it's not hard to imagine the scale of this problem. The troops returning from the battlefield, in many cases inevitably with post-traumatic stress disorder, and civilians living under this kind of stress of constant fear of harm, of bombardment from the Russian enemy. The pressure must be truly, truly colossal.
Massive pressure. Both from the outward stuff and then also the silent things that build. One area we've been particularly concerned about has been traumatic brain injury for troops. You're getting hit by glide bombs, by drones day in, day out. Those micro traumas do manifest. But these are guys who have been out there for 3 years on the front. No major breaks in the fighting or conflict where they're able to really go decompress. And so the moments they do have off, it's essential to be trying to give them care so that we support them while they're out there. And then also we have a way to support them when we have some version of a ceasefire and we have to focus on rehabilitation and reintegration to decompress from the last very tough 3 years.
It is a feature, isn't it, of this kind of harm in the case of troops, for example, on the battlefield in that constant peril, that the harm only becomes apparent later.
Very often, because these guys, to be able to perform at their best, they are just swallowing a lot of this. They're trying to not think about it. This particular style of warfare has additional effects that I think we'll see more of later. As you probably are aware, a lot of guys are wearing these first-person view drones where they wear goggles and are able to see the targets they're hitting, see the eyes of people they kill very up close and personal. And all these add up to a desensitization of what they are doing in terms of when a drone does explode, it is killing a human, a person. And
so, do tell me, Klara, then, what role does AI play in caring for, in treating and helping the people we're talking about?
AI helps in several ways. The first being it is this silent, always on, always ready companion that if you're in a pinch in the middle of the night, you're having a panic attack in a shelter in Ukraine and hearing air raid sirens, you do have some resource to turn to where you can get steps that are vetted by professionals that are anonymous and that are giving you accurate results. You're not just scrolling on the internet hoping something works. You're getting something that is guided by doctors. On the second hand, it also helps by capturing and logging some of the data that we see across Ukraine. And that can help us find patterns. So, for example, in certain areas, you may see people flag trauma or rape or certain crimes or certain, different indicators that we look at. Our hope is that once we have most of Ukraine mapped and we're really getting lots of data in, we'll be able to help direct resources and additional support from Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Defense, different groups, and say, hey, this is what we're flagging in this area. This may need more support. And then thirdly, it helps us create a referral and triage pool. Ukraine inherited this old Soviet-style system of mental health care. There wasn't a lot of existing data before the conflict in terms of what doctors you could turn to, who was reputable. They've kind of been doing this on the fly and trying to build out safe frameworks while they've been in conflict. And so AI is a good triage system. You can give it your city where you are, and we can find free resources for care and interconnect people that we feel.
That's Clara Kaladerovich of Mental Health Global. Now, coming after 6 o'clock, we've got Pienaar and Friends for you. We're going to be joined by Adam Bolton and by our political editor, Anna Mihailovich. First, though, at 5:54, let's catch up with Luke Trill in just a second. This is John Pienaar on Times Radio.
John Pienaar at Drive.
The polling station with Luke Trill on Times Radio. And hi then to Luke Trill from More in Common with the latest roundup of the opinion polls. Hello, Luke.
Good evening.
Hi, I'm looking through the latest wedge of data. Some of it looks pretty familiar, Luke, which is no surprise because it's been saying much the same sort of thing for, well, goodness knows how long, about reform with its more than just its nose in front, and Labour lagging dismally, including Keir Starmer. Interesting numbers about the public's attitude to the asylum policy we heard about this week there. Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So Labour is certainly addressing a problem of public concern. We found that nearly 7 in 10 Britons say that the government doesn't currently have control over our borders and who enters the country. And when we tested the government's new asylum policies, the policies that the Home Secretary announced on Monday, we found reasonably strong support across all of those policies. 7 in 10 Britons support the move to a more temporary asylum status. 68% support restricting the appeal system. Majority support extending the period to settle permanently to 20 years. So across the board, strong support. And also we find that Labour voters, there was some concern that these policies might not appeal to Labour voters, but 2024 Labour voters not only support the policies, but want their MP to support those policies in Parliament.
Yeah, and those numbers on that are pretty emphatic, aren't they? Interestingly, though, when you ask people, should we close our borders to people fleeing war-torn countries, people take a more, sympathetic view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why the Home Secretary was right to say that most Britons remained open and generous. So only 24%, just a quarter of the public, say Britain shouldn't let in anyone fleeing war-torn countries. The majority, 60%, say Britain should let people in, but through controlled and capped routes. So this does seem like it's an area where Labour have hit the sweet spot of public opinion. Though I should say I did a focus group last night and lots of people said we back the policies, but will it actually happen? So I think the proof will be in the pudding for changing those headline voting intention numbers you were just talking about.
Right. I don't want to neglect the issue, the crucially important issue of Gaza, because there's some opinion sampling on that.
Yeah, so what we found in a major new study on Israel-Gaza is that whilst the majority of Britons continue not to sympathise with one side more than the other, amongst those who do, their attitudes are hardening and they don't just disagree with one another, they increasingly think worse of people who support the other side as people. So 4 in 10 people who support Israel or Gaza say they would stop being friends with someone who posted on social media in support of the other side.
Right. Now, we'll just briefly ask you, what are the latest numbers when it comes to support for parties and leaders?
Yeah, so we have Labour on 20%, tied with the Conservatives. Reform out ahead on 30, a 10-point lead. Liberal Democrats on 14, and the Greens on 11, still in double digits.
All right, Luke, great to talk to you. Let's do it again.
Thank you.
Next week. Now, Pienaar Friends is coming up. We're going to be talking about what we've been hearing on this COVID-19 report, the demands for change, the criticism of the way this was handled, the tragedy, the thing was handled at the time. And we're going to be talking about the American-Russian talks on Ukraine. What do we think of those? What do you think of those? I want to hear your thoughts too. Send me a text, send me a tweet. Pienaar Friends is coming up.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. And as promised, Anna Mihайлova joining me now in the studio. And we're going to be joined by Adam Bolton, our Times Radio colleague. We're going to be talking about the COVID-19 report. We're going to be talking about the talks on a peace deal between Russia and America. And there's going to be one of those briefings, news briefings at the White House while we're on air. We're going to be keeping a close eye on that. And we want to hear from you. So join in with a chat after the news. Tom Noonan.
This is Times Radio.
podcast.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with IG.
It is good to have your company on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in good company. Tonight, that is Anna Mihailova, of course, our political editor, and Adam Bolton. As always, they come as kind of a pair on this programme. So good to see both of you. Adam, what is your thought for the day?
Well, I know we're going to talk a lot about the COVID inquiry. My thought for the day is very simple. This should be the end of Boris Johnson as a political figure. There's still romance attached to Boris, as people always call him, and him coming back. But really, we've now got definitively in black and white how he really failed the nation as Prime Minister, took actions which, of course, nearly took his own life, but certainly, according to the report, cost thousands of other lives.
Yeah. I mean, it brings it all back. It was so very, very vivid at the time, but almost anything fades into the background of your memory, including the lockdowns. To say nothing of the circumstances which drove him out of office, which had more to do with conduct, misconduct, and a failure to tell the truth, than simply the lockdowns. You now abandon the idea that any kind of sort of Tory party comeback in that space even is remotely possible.
Well, it should be impossible. I think he's shown himself to be, frankly, not worthy. As I say, there's still a romance around Boris Johnson, but, if we're going to spend, which I think we probably have to, hundreds of millions on an inquiry, and it comes down definitively, naming Boris Johnson, also naming Dominic Cummings. I just really think that any sane person should not take them seriously anymore.
I was just spotted Boris Johnson on X, the social media platform, a little earlier on in the day. He was commenting on, because we're going to be talking later on, of course, about the Ukraine, the American-Russian deal. And it hasn't been massively noticed, but on Congress, they've moved forward on the legislation to hit countries with secondary sanctions who are buying Russian oil, doing business with Russia. It could not notice it. Lindsey Graham, who was a big sponsor of this thing, is saying, because he's pushed it, he said, very glad to see that President Trump's going to back it. And then you see President Trump, who was saying, well, yeah, I did notice they were doing that, and I'm okay with that, which is not exactly a promise of firm action against those countries doing business with Russia who have not been hit already by sanctions. And even Lindsey Graham made the point that this is empowering Donald Trump to take action of that kind. It doesn't mean it will necessarily happen. And of course, Donald Trump hasn't needed legislative backing from Congress for putting sanctions on everyone else in the world. So that is a massive, great open question. But the point is that Boris Johnson greeted this on X by saying it's a huge example of leadership by Donald Trump, which it may or may not be anything of the kind.
Yeah, and we will discuss that. I mean, my own feeling is that there is a kind of attempt by people like Trump and Boris Johnson to say that, the rules don't apply to us, we are such great characters that actually you should ignore the facts before your face because I tell them that you're different. And I think the point I'm making about this report is that, a great deal of time and energy has been devoted to assembling it, and we would be foolish if we let the blarney, charm, bullying of a character like Boris Johnson distract us, that he has some kind of political answer, in the way that I would argue that Trump has successfully distracted America.
Anna.
Well, just to answer Adam's thought for the day, I do think Boris Johnson's comeback is incredibly difficult, but I don't think it's because of this COVID inquiry or COVID. I think it's because of migration. It's hardly anyone even talks about it anymore.
It's all stacking up, isn't it?
But it's interesting because if it was just COVID, I think he probably with the party still could. But I think it's the Boris wave stuff that actually is the most damaging in terms of his prospects. But I find it really interesting that the points you make about what it means for his political future, and of course he probably does. We know he had ambitions anyway, whatever they are now. What does it mean for the person who's still at the heart of government? I mean, that's what is the burning question. So Chris Wormold was in charge of pandemic preparations, has been given a scathing review by the inquiry, and is now one of the most significant and important figures at the heart of government. He's cabinet secretary. He was Keir Starmer's appointment, and there's been speculation about his future already for a while, and various briefings against him internally to journalists. But here, it's pretty stark. He has been blamed for misleading Downing Street at the height of that pandemic, and saying that he was aware of the failings in the Department of Health, which he ran at the time, but that he did not pass those on to number 10 in that crucial moment when Matt Hancock came in and told everyone essentially that the department was really well prepared and was over-enthusiastic is the quote. But while perhaps you can expect Matt Hancock in his personality and in the way that politicians maybe do not know the detail in the way that the head of the department, the permanent secretary should, and the civil servant should, Chris Wormold at that point did not go into number 10 and say, actually, that enthusiastic impression is not correct. You've also got Dominic Cummings today coming out and saying that claiming that Chris Wormold was the main proponent of these chickenpox parties, that was his idea and he was the one who put it forward.
Well, Patrick Vallance, to a certain extent, in the early stages, was talking about generating herd immunity as well, and he, of course, is now a science minister in the House of Lords. So I think, there's blame to go around. I have to say, I hold no particular brief for Chris Wormold, but I do think we are seeing a rather unhealthy operation by the present number 10 to kind of point the finger in Wormold's direction and possibly to make it an excuse for him moving on from his job of cabinet secretary. Whereas I feel to say, Wormold had to go if he does have to go because of this, would really raise, if you think it through, big questions about Keir Starmer's management. I mean, he only a few months ago picked this man to be the cabinet secretary. It was known about his role at the Department of Health at the time, certainly within the civil service. It was known what sort of person he was, and if they now try and hang this round his neck, I think he will have been treated unfairly. And I would also just make one point. I don't know, how it works precisely, but I do not think it is seen as the job of the permanent undersecretary at a department to contradict the minister. I just don't think that that's their job. I mean, they can imply, they can infer, but to go into Downing Street and say, Matt Hancock's just blown a lot of smoke around, I just don't think that's what civil servants do.
Yeah. So when you say an excuse to get rid of Chris Wormold, at bottom, what would be the actual reason for that? That he's just judged not to be any good at his job?
Well, yet again, the government, the present government, is clearly not functioning very well. And, Keir Starmer has shown a willingness to blame others for that happening.
Well, and there have been concerns internally that Chris Wormold is not delivering in the way they thought. He's not being effective enough in making things happen. And, there's this constant complaint from senior Labour politicians that they're frustrated, and Keir Starmer's personally frustrated, that things in government, surprise, surprise, don't move quickly. You don't pull a lever and things don't just happen. And, first Sue Gray was brought in to be that driver of actual delivery, and they found that she wasn't doing it. She was actually holding a lot of things up, was the complaint. And then a similar complaint seems to be made about Chris Wormold. But allies of Chris Wormold or defenders of Chris Wormold will all have said that you knew what kind of person you were appointing when you appointed him. He's not someone... He's a full-on career civil servant, and he is not ever going to be...
Third generation senior civil servant.
Because before his appointment, there was all this talk they were going to come in and just rip it all up, start again, really make everything move much more efficiently, and then Chris Starmer was appointed, and of course he's extremely establishment, as Adam's just insightfully pointed out. So that is why, I mean, you say there'll be questions of Keir Starmer's management. There already are questions about Keir Starmer's management, and this appointment was one of them.
That's another example of putting someone in a really, really quite important position deep in the machine, and it turns out to be the wrong call. It's the wrong person doing the wrong job, and it was Keir Starmer's responsibility.
And he knew that this inquiry was going on and was going to come out.
I mean, this is going to sound grim. What is Keir Starmer good at?
I think he was quite a good human rights lawyer. I mean, I think he's a good lawyer. And lawyers, of course, don't take decisions.
He's a good lawyer.
They accept briefs.
Well, hold on. Let's not be too, Keir Starmer, don't remember, when he became leader of the opposition, everyone thought, oh, right, he'll be a placeholder leader. That was the whole narrative. Yeah. No one believed he could turn things around like he did, that he could transform the Labour Party from Corbynism to what it is. Whatever you think of what it is, he was certainly effective in doing that. But, of course, that was... You can say that was
before he became prime minister.
Before he became prime minister, but I think we need to be a little bit careful, and not completely getting into a narrative. Whole narrative.
You don't have to get into a narrative. So let's suppose that question, because he replaced Jeremy Corbyn, he pretty much buried all the baggage that went with Jeremy Corbyn. He was not Jeremy Corbyn. He repudiated a lot of what Jeremy Corbyn stood for, especially where allegations of anti-Semitism was concerned. But, again, with the benefit of hindsight, how far did that really go? Because dumping, well, not just Jeremy Corbyn, but all the promises that he made to become leader, I'm not making a personal political judgment here, it's what happened. And so it had the effect. He got in. You could argue quite strongly that he got in, Labour got in. That had a lot to do with people just having more than enough of the outgoing government. And since that moment, again, the question gets louder and louder. What is Keir Starmer good for? And I don't put that by way of a punch in the face to the Prime Minister. I just think it becomes a very relevant, very real question.
Yeah, and it has to be said, John, it is being asked by a lot of people who are normally sympathetic or certainly give a fair hearing to Labour. I mean, the latest one, Martin Kettle, a columnist in The Guardian today, saying that earlier this week it was Raphael Baer, the columnist in The Guardian, saying that. We had Janan Ganesh in the Financial Times. I mean, those people who are seen as being sympathetic to the centre-left, if you like, do appear to have given up, and that's from Starmer's own side, if you see what I mean.
The question seems to be screaming out. And I want to talk in a moment about more about the COVID inquiry and thoughts that arise from that, and whatever else jumps into the conversation along the way. And I want to hear what you are thinking listening to this. Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, a tweet to @Times Radio. Here on Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio.
Times Radio Drive with IG. Invest more, pay less with zero commission on all stocks and shares. Search IG.com to find out more. Capital at risk, other fees may apply.
So here on Pienaar and Friends, we've got Adam Bolton, we've got Anna Mihailova, and we'll see what we can make of the COVID-19 inquiry report, which is published just in the last couple of hours, so still being digested. And of course what really matters is what follows from the COVID inquiry report, the lessons that are taken from it, the action that follows to do something to make sure that the same mistakes at least are not made again. We heard Baroness Hallett at the beginning of proceedings laying out criticism of all the governments in the UK.
This meant a national lockdown became more likely. The inquiry does not advocate for national lockdowns, far from it. Restricting people's liberty in such a draconian fashion, with all the devastating consequences, should be avoided if at all possible. But to avoid them, governments must take timely and decisive action to control a spreading virus. The 4 governments of the UK did not.
Lady Hallett heavily criticised what she called a lack of urgency by the government.
Nonetheless, I can summarise my findings of the response as too little, too late. All 4 governments failed to appreciate the scale of the threat or the urgency of response it demanded in the early part of 2020, relying in part on misleading assurances that the UK was properly prepared for a pandemic.
And of course, she said the timing of lockdowns cost lives.
Had the lockdown been imposed 1 week earlier than the 23rd of March, the evidence suggests that the number of deaths in England alone in the first wave up until the 1st of July 2020 would have been reduced by 48%. That is approximately 23,000 fewer deaths. The decision to impose the first UK-wide lockdown was remarkable for the failure on the part of all 4 governments to anticipate or plan for the possible need for a mandatory lockdown.
Lady Hallett discussed how the culture affected decision-making.
Finally, under this heading, there was a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of the UK government, and the relationship between ministers in Northern Ireland was poor. This kind of culture is detrimental to good decision-making.
And of course, this was not an examination in any academic sense of the business of decision-making in government. I spoke to Rivka Gottlieb, who's a spokesperson for the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice.
I actually didn't anticipate how angry and how upset I would be feeling. In many ways, the report is vindication because it says a lot of what we have been saying all along. But it's outrageous. It's shocking to hear it again. And I think as a society, we've moved on and we've forgotten. There's been a bit of a collective amnesia, but we mustn't forget, because if we do, this will happen again.
We've got leave for COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. When you heard what you heard and you've seen what you've seen since the report was released, Adam and Anna, what thoughts are foremost in your minds? We're looking at I suppose a complex blend of structural mistakes. The fact that everyone was working rather in the dark, the data that was pouring in was unfamiliar, and it couldn't be familiar. Then you had problems which arose from clashes of personality, clashes of ego, and disentangling all of that to make a sort of clear lesson that can be applied in the future. That is quite a delicate business, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and that's why I think that this inquiry was important, however expensive and cumbersome it is, to actually establish the facts of what went on and to a certain extent point the finger of blame. And the reason why I think this inquiry was important is because the UK's performance dealing with the COVID pandemic was relatively poor. I mean, I've been looking at the chart, for example, of deaths per capita, and the UK is 19th. Now that is behind, not very far behind, it's behind the US, it's behind Italy and some East European countries that got the pandemic first. But most of the equivalent countries to us, you know, France, Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, they all did better. And you know, I'm a British patriot. I think we all, you know, got the NHS, which is supposed to be the virtue of the world. We should have done better than that. I mean, France, for example, is about 40th. We're about 20th in global deaths per million. Our deaths per million were 3,400. Their deaths per million were 2,600. So that is that's 800 less deaths per million. Multiply that by the population, and France did a lot better. So we need to know what went wrong, and I think this report has put its finger on it, and really it's up to us to learn the lessons of that, and in a sense, it tells us that we know that the Johnson government was dysfunctional. Well, we know that anyway, and its own MPs voted it out of existence, so that is not a surprise. But this going into it and actually saying, what could we have done better, I think is very important.
Yeah, ultimately the important thing. Anna.
I mean, for me, one of my biggest takeaways is when you look at, we keep talking about trust in politics and trust in our institutions, and that is such a big theme that explains trends these days, so many of the trends. And if you look at the conclusions of the inquiry, I mean, there are 2 points. One, it says very starkly that the public lost confidence in ministers breaking the rules. Because, in the rewriting all of this, sometimes there are people who minimise it and talk about the drinking and downstream and say, oh, it was just cake and all of that.
Yes.
This makes it very clear the impact that had longer term, and also it has strong words for the scientific advisors that there was too much flawed scientific advice in the early days, and again, when you look at that question of trust and how you've had this surge of conspiracy theories online, this move away from the anti-vax movement. All of that, I think, has roots in this, and it's really important to look at it really closely and take heed and take lessons from it, and effectively for a lot of people to do better going forward.
I mean, that focus on trust is worth focusing quite strongly on, isn't it? Because in the end, this is about people. Imagine you're one of those. I spoke to one of them earlier on who'd lost a loved one during the pandemic, and then you see a report that says 23,000 people, perhaps, lost their lives, arguably unnecessarily, because the government was not just slow to introduce restrictions when it could have done, but should have been faster, had every reason to be faster. Imagine how that hurts. Imagine being a parent of one of the children whose education, whose lives were set back by the pandemic in a way they may never get over, whose education and learning was interrupted. If they happened to come from a less advantaged background, they didn't just slow down, they went backwards and may never make up that ground in the future, no matter what anyone tries. Those are the human stories behind all of this. But trust, that is also an important part of the discussion, because you can say that the collapse of trust, the rage over Partygate, which some still do not understand, that was part of a continuing process of the destruction of trust between people and politics in our country.
Yes, I entirely agree with that, and I think Anna's made absolutely the right point. But the corollary of that, and I think the other side of this report shows, is that the alternative, if you like, the anti-vaxxers, the don't wear a mask, why do we ever have a shutdown, all that brigade, this report also quite clearly shows that they were wrong as well, and that is important, because there are people, quite significant political movement now trying to exploit the lack of trust to their political advantage, and I think this does put a line down there, actually saying, well, go ahead and prove that the right measures weren't taken. And she does say in the report a number of times that the right measures were taken. I mean, one of the remarkable things about the report is how she says when the second wave came, the government appeared to have learnt no lessons whatsoever.
Yes.
And that is inexcusable.
Yes.
Fool me once is okay, but fool me twice,
And yet more harm was done in the spring of 2021.
Yeah.
We need to move on because we do. Later on after the news, we're going to be crossing to the States and getting a take from there on what is going on there. Among other things, the peace plan, if it turns out to be any kind of peace plan between in Ukraine, thrashed out between representatives of the White House and the Kremlin. Now, though, here's Kate Borsay, who takes over at 7. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. We'll continue the assessment of what we've heard from Baroness Hallett and this particular stage of the very lengthy 10-module COVID inquiry. Eleanor Hayward's back. She's had more time to digest. I know she spoke to you earlier, John. She'll be in the studio with us, just helping us to break it all down and get an understanding of what's there. And Adam's point about how lockdown sceptics have finally got their answer is a good one. But I actually wonder whether their ears are open to listening, or whether one of the issues with this inquiry... Well, exactly. Whether one of the issues of this inquiry is that it has come way down the track, and that actually these 23,000 deaths that could have been avoided had we locked down a week earlier, the ill-preparedness, the devastating, chaotic ill-preparedness before the pandemic led to the loss of lives, whether some of what we've been hearing actually is what they'd expect an inquiry to say, sort of ignorant of the fact that it's an independent inquiry, it's not a political inquiry. So my question is, while this is great that we've got some certainty and it comes from hours and hours of research and hundreds and thousands of pages of it and messages exchanged between everyone involved, actually whether it's going to put some of those voices to bed, or whether this is just simply an exercise for the next time. And actually, is there enough to learn from this for us to be sure that there will be a different approach next time? As scientists say, it is inevitable that we have another pandemic. So there's lots to discuss. I was looking at some of the comments about the fact that lockdown was delayed because of the concern of behavioural fatigue. We're going to speak to a psychology professor, Dr. Stephen Reicher, this evening, who was on that SAGE subcommittee advising on behavioural science. So we'll talk to him. We're also going to go to the G20 in South Africa as well. We'll be speaking to someone for the Atlantic Council there. The US have boycotted it because of South Africa's treatment of white farmers, but now they are apparently considering a U-turn and may well attend the G20 in South Africa. So we'll take a look at that. Much more besides on the show. We actually finish at 9. Joe Coburn is here with the Great Times Gender Debate at 9 o'clock. So our regular listeners can look forward to that. It will be a great evening this evening, hosted by Joe. And we'll talk to Joe a little bit about what to expect during our show as well.
All right, lots of good stuff coming up here on Times Radio, and we're going to be looking at what's going on in America. I see there's a news conference at the White House taking place now. We're keeping an eye on that as well. I promise you, you will not miss anything. You will wish not to miss. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio. Time for
Times Radio Drive with IG. Invest more, pay less with zero commission on all stocks and shares. Search IG.com to find out more. Capital at risk, other fees may apply.
And I'm John Pienaar. Here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Adam Bolton and Anna Mihailova. And we're going to be talking in a moment to Sarah Baxter in New York City, Director of the Marie Colvin Centre for International Reporting. Hello, Sarah. Welcome back.
Hello, John. Good to be here.
It's great to have you in the circle, Sarah. So, shall we talk about the plan for Ukraine? I say the plan. It's a plan which seems to be formed between envoys of the President of the United States and Putin in the Kremlin. Ukraine haven't had very much to do with it, really, quite deliberately. Same goes for Ukraine's friends in Europe. And now there is a plan with a very uncertain, to put it very mildly, chance of making progress. When I spoke earlier on, so listen back to this, to Professor Phillips O'Brien, highly respected strategic thinker and academic at St Andrews University. As you'll hear in just a second, he was certainly not impressed with that. We got a more, I suppose, political, with a small p, analysis from General David Petraeus. Just listen to this. But between the two of them, you get a sense of, what does this really add up to and why? Here's Professor Phillips O'Brien.
It's a terrible deal for Ukraine. I mean, it's basically the Russian deal, which the U.S. government has agreed to. So Russia gets almost everything it wants and gives up almost nothing. The issue, and the Ukrainians will not want this deal under almost any circumstances. It's hard to see how Ukraine could exist as an independent country if this deal goes through. The problem that Ukraine will face is we don't know what the European reaction will be. The European states are going to have to, at this point, if the U.S. is very serious about this deal, and Trump has endorsed it, if the U.S. is serious about this deal and tries to impose it, then European states are either going to have to stand up for Ukraine and say, no, we'll back you if you turn it down, or put pressure on Ukraine to accept it or a version close to it. So we would reach a real crunch point if that happens. We're not there yet, but this is a terrible deal for Ukraine.
So, put it mildly, not impressed. And of course I spoke to General David Petraeus, who chose his words very carefully, but have a listen to this, his ideas of how Russia should be the one being forced to the negotiating table.
I actually think you could have a Russian cessation of hostilities at both countries. And then if you add a third component, which would be ironclad threats, that if Russia resumes aggression, that you will take further actions to sanction them financially and economically. And you'll also have an ironclad promise to help Ukraine even more than we have, that you might even make this cessation durable.
So General David Petraeus then talking about just a short while ago. So Sarah Baxter, give me a bit of a perspective from there. There was some early, I suppose, you might have expected it, some sort of speculation. Was this Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy in Ukraine, sort of going off, just chancing his arm, talking to those he likes talking to in Moscow and coming up with this? But no, this has very much got Donald Trump's stamp on it, hasn't it?
Yeah, Steve Witkoff is a personal friend of Donald Trump. He's his personally selected envoy and enjoys a very trusting relationship with the president, and that's why European allies are so alarmed, because they don't seem to have been consulted at all over this. And Witkoff has been doing his own thing with Vladimir Putin, and that makes Europe very nervous, and of course Ukraine is feeling very bewildered. The trouble is that President Zelensky has got mired in a corruption scandal in Ukraine that he's trying very hard to extricate himself from, and Russian forces are doing a little bit better than they were before. They still have absolutely no hope of really taking any more territory in a significant way by force, but they're sort of, things go up and down, and at the moment they're winning that war of attrition. And I put it winning in inverted commas, really. I don't want people to make too much of it, but as soon as Putin gets any whiff of getting the upper hand, he wants to extract maximum concessions. And in Donald Trump, he has somebody who also wants a peace plan. I mean, for goodness sakes, people back in America are screaming about the fact that Trump is spending too much time neglecting America first at the expense of chasing a Nobel Peace Prize, which so far Donald Trump has no signs really of getting. He hasn't landed the big ones quite yet, although, some things are going well in Gaza with the UN resolution. So he really wants to land this. Otherwise, he's been ignoring the American economy, as some might say, for nothing. So this is the problem for Ukraine at the moment. You've got Putin, who would like a deal on his own terms that stuffs Ukraine, and Donald Trump, who wants to emerge as the peacemaker.
But isn't it, well, from what we've seen, because the Axios news service in America has been making the running on all of this, I haven't seen any of their detail contradicted. If that's correct, we're talking about a deal in which Russia gets to take hold of territory in eastern Ukraine that they've been unable to take by force. It would mean giving Putin exactly what he wants in so many respects, which is in those eastern areas. Russia becomes the official language. The Orthodox Russian Church becomes the official church. There are strict limitations on Ukraine's ability to defend itself, and on it goes. This is another plan for peace, very much, it seems, on Russia's terms. And any thought of Donald Trump, as some were suggesting he might have been a short while ago, getting tougher on Putin, losing patience with Putin, it just seems to have rolled right back again.
Yeah, you just have to hope that this is a negotiating tactic which Europe and Ukraine then vetoes, and then they come in and suggest something that is closer to a ceasefire along present lines, which I think everybody accepts, that Ukraine is going to have to concede some territory because it's also in the same position as Russia, as not being able to really retake territory that it's lost, and one has to be realistic about that. But the idea that Ukraine is going to hand over territory that they have never had to lose, I think is for the birds. They're just not going to do it.
Adam?
I've been struck by two things. One is how I don't think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think, Sarah, this is playing particularly big with the American media, probably because they're not that interested in Ukraine. And I do feel that since this plan came out, we should have heard from European leaders rather more strongly than we have done. That
the French Foreign Minister was pretty dismissive in Brussels. They've been meeting.
I know they've been saying things. There's been a meeting of foreign ministers, and they came out and said, well, it's not acceptable for America and Russia to settle this. You have to involve Ukraine. Well, I mean, that's pretty obvious. But I do think it would cost nothing for Britain and America, Britain and the rest of Europe, to say it is unacceptable that unprovoked aggression in Europe should be rewarded, and that we will not be party to any settlement. And that would mean possibly shouldering more of the burden of of supporting Ukraine. But I mean, that is where we are. Hamish Falconer made a statement in the Commons today, and again reiterated Ukraine's got to be involved. But that, I think, is feebler than actually saying, to Trump quite clearly, this is not going to be settled on your terms as a convenience. And A, and B, if you attempt to force this through, and it's not clear he's got the applications, you were saying earlier on, Congress has actually voted to strengthen tariffs against Russia, but if you were to force this through, that is an absolute bar on getting any Nobel Peace Prize, because it's it's aggressor's justice, and how could anyone say that was something worthy of receiving an award?
Well, you're quite right, Adam, about the Nobel Peace Prize. But I do think that European leaders, who I'd love to hear more strongly on this subject, but they might well find that if they say to Donald Trump, we're not signing off on this, and we really, you do not have our support on this, he's quite capable of saying, fine, the bill's on you now.
Well, he's more or less done that anyway.
Yeah, but that would be the logical. He could yes, he has. I mean, military aid to Ukraine from America has ceased. He has been in the business of selling weapons, so it's more of an arms dealer than a peace broker in many ways. But he could stop doing even that, which would be a setback. And the European leaders still seem to want to try and try again to persuade Donald Trump round to their way of thinking.
I think the reason they haven't commented much is because it would draw attention to their own weaknesses. They don't want to draw attention to the fact that they don't seem to be particularly in the tent on this. So that obviously limits the perception of their influence. Yeah. Well, it is, but I think that's they're still obviously aware that the person they need to influence most is Donald Trump. Keir Starmer's certainly aware of that. So I think that's why. But in the context of the G20 about to happen, it's all quite. It'll be interesting if they can hold that line.
Yeah. Which America's not going to. America is boycotting G20 because of the claims that white South Africans are suffering persecution. Yeah. Elon Musk's claims.
Okay, yes. Well, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, there's been a rapprochement, by the way, between Elon Musk and Donald Trump after months feuding, and there's no question that Adam is right, that that Trump has seized on the idea that white South Africans are the most persecuted people in the world and the only ones really deserving of refugee status in America. So you can see where his thinking is going regarding the G20. But on Ukraine, I think another reason, I think Anna's made a wise point there, but another reason why they're holding out and trying to make private remonstrances with Trump, sotto voce, is that Trump does change his mind. And they don't want to say, well, it's all over then for Ukraine just because of Witkoff's latest plan.
Now, it's also fair to say he does appear to change his mind, then he changes it back again and ends up on the path that he seems to have been on all along, which is one which is not uncomfortable for Vladimir Putin and is uncomfortable for those who want him to take a different path. But maybe Philip O'Brien is absolutely right. This is coming to a crunch where the European leaders who support Ukraine have to kind of put their cards down and say, this will not fly, we will take the slack, because it looks as if you are clearly not going to do that. And meanwhile, talking about a coalition of the willing being deployed in circumstances no one can even set out, while Vladimir Putin is saying that's not going to be allowed to happen. We have yet another meeting on what the coalition of the willing looks like. It's a circular debate.
But also be quite clear about this, that the proposal halving the size of the Ukrainian army and Ukraine having to give up its most potent weapons, that is basically just saying, this peace settlement puts Ukraine on notice to be rolled over by Russia at a date of President Putin's convenience. That's not acceptable, and I don't see why. I really don't see why that can't be spelt out by senior European politicians.
Okay, we're going to hold that thought. We're going to talk in a moment, if we can, Sarah, about what is going on with the Epstein files and what isn't going on, because the deadline came and went today for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to offer some sort of testimony, some sort of cooperation to the Congressional Committee into Jeffrey Epstein. Seems nothing happened. He just ignored the whole thing. Where on earth is that going now? This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with IG.com.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Anna Mihailova, Adam Bolton and Sarah Baxter from the other side of the Atlantic. What is there to report, Sarah, where the Epstein files are concerned? The laws in place for these papers, the endless thousands of documents and pieces of evidence to be made public. We don't yet know precisely what will be made public. There are reasons why not all of it, by any means, will be. We do know that so far, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has not fallen over himself to cooperate with the Congressional Committee into Epstein.
Yeah, I don't expect Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to show his face in America anytime soon. He's just can't take the risk of landing on American soil, and he's going
or even contribute from here or wherever he is.
No, he's not. He doesn't have to. He can't be compelled to, unlike a US citizen who is subpoenaed to appear before Congress. So he's not going to, in my view. But obviously, I think he should do the right thing and volunteer, but that hasn't been his modus operandi thus far, so I don't suppose it's going to change soon. Regarding the disclosure of the Epstein files, I mean, this one is going to run and run. It's already causing huge rips in the MAGAverse, and with enmity now between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump, and her own party in Georgia backing her definitively. So it's very interesting the way Epstein manages to rupture so many relationships. But it's also the case that people are very suspicious now that Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, is not going to release all the files. It's going to be a bit of a no-show, a bit as before, where people get heavily redacted documents where they start to say, well, hang on, didn't we know all this already? And they're constantly looking for fresh revelations. And then the other thing that strikes me is, of course, rather like the Me Too scandal, because Democrats take this kind of sexual depredation more seriously perhaps than some Republicans do, they're the ones falling on their sword, such as Larry Summers, a former economic advisor to Barack Obama, former president of Harvard, is having to give up all sorts of roles in public affairs and boardships, etc. He's no longer going to be contributing to the New York Times because he's named in the Epstein files. I mean, of course, we know what happened to our own Lord Mandelson, no longer UK ambassador. But, you know, Trump people have so many allegations against them regarding all kinds of alleged sexual malfeasance that they just seem to be able to steamroll it, and Trump gets away, at least thus far, with saying it's a Democratic hoax, and they're more in trouble than the Republicans.
And what would stop all the more documents, or enough documents, or a huge amount of documents coming out, Sarah? Are we talking about the investigation the president's ordered into Bill Clinton and other Democrats being used as a reason not to disclose? Or are we talking about the fact that they're able to keep as under wraps classified material? I'm not quite sure how it would be classified, but would that be it?
I think there are all kinds of excuses being made, and one is exactly the one that you suggested, which is that with ongoing investigations that the president has ordered, although this Department of Justice is supposed to be independent, into Bill Clinton and people like Larry Summers and some Democratic donors, that they think they can then say, because of these court cases, privacy concerns mean we can't release X, Y, and Z. So that's one reason. Another reason is there still seems to be expressions of concern, shall we say, about releasing the names of individuals who may be wrongly swept up into this without due diligence. I don't think that's really bothered anybody in MAGA before either. But there are a host of excuses that can be used to keep delaying and obfuscating, for sure.
And Sarah, whether or not he appears before Congress, which I think is very unlikely, I mean, it's fair to say that for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as we now must call him, what is being revealed is not good news, is it?
Well, no. I mean, the more one looks into what's coming out in these files, the more sleazy and the more names appear. In fact, it's not just, I mean, even Donald Trump keeps finding his name brought up in context. I mean, Epstein's brother's now claiming that Epstein talked to Trump by phone in 2016 when Trump won, when they were supposed to have no communications at all. And Andrew, it keeps revealing more and more sleazy things, including an allegation that he had sex with someone, totally unprovable here, by the way, I should say, but that he he had sex with one of Epstein's employees, and of course that's taken to mean Virginia Giuffre, but who knows? It could be somebody else.
I mean, it's very interesting, given that he, completely denies any wrongdoing. This is this exchange with a New York Times reporter called Landon Thomas Jr., who was discussing in 2015 with Epstein as a friend or an advisor how Epstein could distance himself from the scandal, and actually just says, he had consensual sex with one of your employees. And I understand he's now rowed back and said that he didn't know himself whether this was the case, but it was what he'd read in the press. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. There's so many allegations, and of course, extraordinary excuses as well, mounted by Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, who still claims that the photograph of him with.
Well, we'll have to watch how that develops, or not, as seems more likely. I just want to break in now to the White House news conference with Caroline Levitt, the President's press secretary, at the podium, taking questions on Ukraine.
Reports that President Zelensky said, he's looking to look at the plan, that there's been reports about the Trump administration proposing a plan. Can you just give an update on where Russia-Ukraine stands, and does the president plan to speak with Zelensky anytime soon, or when can you expect that?
So I'm happy to provide an update. I've seen quite a bit of reporting on the latest with Russia-Ukraine, so let me clarify and give you guys the truth on where it currently stands. President Trump has made it very clear since day one, and even on the campaign trail, that he wants to see this war come to an end. He has grown increasingly frustrated with both sides of this war, Russia and Ukraine alike, for their refusal to commit to a peace agreement. But nevertheless, the president and his national security team are steadfast in seeing this war come to an end, to end the killing and deliver on the president's promise. Special Envoy Witkoff, that Marco Rubio, have been working on a plan quietly for about the last month. They've been engaging with both sides, Russia and Ukraine, equally, to understand what these countries would commit to in order to see a lasting and durable peace. That's how you get to a peace negotiation, right? That's how it worked with Israel, with respect to Israel and Gaza and all of the Arab countries in the Middle East. That's how we accomplished that historic agreement, which the UN, by the way, voted to commit to and accept this week, which was a huge monumental moment. So they have been engaged with both sides, and these talks are continuing. As always, I'm not going to litigate the details of this plan as it's ongoing and it's in flux, but the president supports this plan. It's a good plan for both Russia and Ukraine, and we believe that it should be acceptable to both sides, and we're working very hard to get it done. And I'll also add, I know Secretary Driscoll did meet with President Zelensky today. We spoke with him. He was very optimistic following that meeting, and so again, we are having good conversations with both sides with respect to ending this war.
Carolyn?
Sure. Go ahead.
Follow up on Ukraine. You said this is a good plan. So according to our sources, this proposal demands major concessions from Ukraine and doesn't demand much from Russia. So was Russia involved in drafting
Your
this?
understanding is wrong. Have you read the full plan? You haven't.
Yes. So if you can give details, maybe.
You've read reporting from one side of the war, and so I want you to understand that the administration has talked equally with both sides. You have seen President Trump engage directly with both President Putin and President Zelensky. Likewise, his national security team has as well. In fact, Special Envoy Witkoff and Secretary Rubio met with some of the Ukrainians just in the past week to discuss this very plan. And so just like you saw with respect to Israel and Gaza, we are hearing out both sides of this war to understand what can you commit to end the war. And that's ultimately how we are going to get to an agreeable solution. That's what the president has directed of his team.
So there's Caroline Levitt taking the question there on the Ukraine peace plan, and the suggestion there was that the version of the peace plan that we've seen so far, it's based from reporting by Axios, isn't the whole story. It's not as pro-Russian as the questioner there in the White House briefing room is assuming, and pretty much everyone else who's seen that reporting and drawn their own conclusions is also assuming. Well, we'll see. If there's more to it, if there's another side to it, we'll all be fascinated to see that, because this story's got a way to run, and we have to stop now because we just do. Great to have you here, Adam. Good to see you again, Anna. See you again very soon. And Leahy was our producer, and Isaac Marley, our technical operator, and Kate's up next on Times Radio.
across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
Thanks, John. Have a great weekend. It is 7 o'clock. This is the evening edition with Kate Borsay. Coming up,
there was a toxic and chaotic culture